Grant Mercer's laugh cut across the platform like a whip crack. Well, look at that. He didn't lower his voice. He never did. Cole brought himself a mail-order bride and got a farmhand instead. The crowd at Billings Station turned. Every head, every pair of eyes landing on the woman standing at the bottom of the train steps. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a single worn bag and a sealed envelope she hadn't asked to deliver. Cole Mercer stood 10 feet away and didn't move. Grant stepped closer to his cousin's ear, but loud enough for a dozen people to hear. "You paid good money for a wife, Cole. Looks like somebody sent you a plow horse by mistake." The laughter that followed wasn't from everyone, but it was from enough. If you've ever been humiliated in public for something that wasn't your fault, if you've ever stood somewhere you weren't wanted and had to decide in 3 seconds whether to shrink or stand, then you already know exactly what Naomi Cross felt in that moment. What would you have done? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear doesn't go where you think it's going. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, hit that like button. It costs nothing and means everything. Now, let's go back to that train platform, because what happened next changed two lives that had already been connected in ways neither of them understood yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in February, which Cole Mercer would later remember only because the pipes under the kitchen sink had frozen that same morning, and he'd spent 3 hours on his back in the cold trying to fix them before giving up and calling old Pete Halverson, who charged $40 and fixed it in 8 minutes without saying a single word about it. That was the kind of day it had been. He'd found the envelope wedged between a seed catalog and an overdue farrier bill, and he'd stood at the kitchen counter reading it 3 times before he sat down. The woman he'd been writing to for 11 months, a widow named Clara Hutchins from a small town outside of Cheyenne, had written to say that she was sorry, that she had appreciated every letter he'd ever sent her, that she believed he was a good man, but that she had boarded the train and ridden it as far as Denver before she realized she couldn't do it. She'd gotten off. She was going home. She hadn't been able to bring herself to write to him directly, she explained, so she'd given the letter to a woman on the platform who was traveling to Billings anyway and had agreed to deliver it. Cole had read that part 4 times. She'd given the letter to a stranger. He'd set the envelope on the counter next to his cold coffee and stared at the wall for a long time. The ranch had been bleeding money for 2 years. The crew was half what it used to be. The fencing on the north pasture had been failing since October, and he hadn't had the hands to fix all of it. His father had built Walker Ranch from nothing, 40 years and 2 droughts and 1 catastrophic flood, and Cole had been running it alone for 3 years since his father's death, and he was tired in the kind of way that sleep didn't fix. He had not been looking for love when he'd started writing to Clara Hutchins. He'd been looking for a partner, someone to share the weight of a life that had gotten too heavy for one set of hands. He wasn't proud of that distinction, but he wasn't going to lie about it either. The morning of March 14th, Cole drove his truck to Billings Station and parked crooked because the lot was fuller than he'd expected. He'd put on a clean shirt and his good hat, the one he kept on the top shelf and only wore for occasions that required it. He told himself on the drive over that he wasn't nervous, which was how he knew he was. The train from Denver arrived at 11:42, which was 4 minutes late. He stood near the far end of the platform, away from the cluster of people waiting, and he watched the doors open and the passengers step off one by one. He was watching for a woman he'd only ever seen in 2 photographs, both slightly out of focus, both taken in bright sunlight. And he was aware, with a dim and uncomfortable certainty, that this was a strange way to begin any kind of life with anyone. That was when Grant showed up. Cole heard him before he saw him. Grant Mercer had a voice that carried whether he intended it to or not, and on most days he intended it to. He was 3 years older than Cole, heavier through the shoulders but soft in the middle, and he had the kind of smile that looked genuine right up until you looked at his eyes. "Didn't know you were coming," Cole said. "Heard you were picking up your bride." Grant settled beside him like he'd been invited. "Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about." "There's no fuss." 11 months of letters, Cole. That's at least some fuss." Cole didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the train. That was when he saw her. She was one of the last passengers off. Tall, nearly as tall as him, which Cole registered with a slight adjustment of his expectations. strong through the arms and shoulders in a way that said the strength was earned and not accidental. She wore a dark green coat that had been good quality once and was still decent, and she carried a single worn bag over one shoulder. In her other hand, she held a sealed envelope. She stepped off the train and stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked directly at him. Not at the crowd, not around the platform. Directly at him, like she'd known exactly where he was standing, and her expression was the kind that had decided something already and was prepared to hold to it regardless of how it went. Cole felt the wrongness of the situation settle into him like cold water. This was not Clara Hutchins. The photographs had been small and blurred, but not that blurred. Grant's laugh cracked across the platform before Cole could take a step. "Well, look at that." Full voice. Full pleasure. Cole brought himself a mail-order bride and got a farmhand instead. People turned. Cole didn't move because he was still processing the gap between what he'd expected and what was standing in front of him, and his brain was doing the kind of slow, grinding recalculation that happens when reality doesn't match the picture you'd been carrying around for almost a year. Grant stepped close to his ear, not close enough to be private, just close enough to perform the intimacy of it. "You paid good money for a wife, Cole. Looks like somebody sent you a plow horse by mistake." The laughter came from a handful of men near the station door. Cole heard it the way you hear something through water, muffled but unmistakable. He looked at the woman. She had heard every word. He could see that she had. Her jaw had tightened and something had shifted just slightly in her eyes, but she hadn't looked away and she hadn't flinched, and she was still walking toward him with the same measured, deliberate steps she'd started with. She stopped 4 feet away and held out the envelope. "My name is Naomi Cross," she said. Her voice was even, completely even. "I was on the platform in Denver when a woman named Clara Hutchins asked me to deliver this. She said you'd know what it was." Cole took the envelope. He didn't open it. He already knew. "She didn't come," he said. "No," Naomi said. "She didn't." There was a pause between them that lasted only a few seconds but felt considerably longer, and during it Cole became acutely aware that Grant was still standing 3 feet to his left, and that at least 15 people on the platform were watching this exchange with the particular attention that people reserve for other people's disasters. "I'm sorry," Naomi said. And then, because she seemed like a woman who said what she meant, and meant only what she said, "That's a hard thing to have happen in public." Cole looked at her for a moment. "You didn't have to bring the letter. She was in a state. I told her I'd make sure you got it." A brief pause. "I keep my word." Grant made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Well, that's something. The consolation prize has integrity." Cole turned to his cousin slowly. "Go home, Grant. Grant, I'm just saying, I know what you're saying." Cole's voice had gone flat in a way that people who knew him recognized as the last warning before something irreversible happened. "Go home." Grant held his smile for 2 more seconds, then lifted both hands in a gesture of mock surrender and walked back toward the station, laughing quietly to himself. And Cole watched him go with the feeling of someone who has just seen a problem walk away temporarily instead of permanently. He turned back to Naomi. She was watching him with an expression that was hard to read, cautious, assessing, but not unkind. She had the steady gaze of someone who had been evaluated by strangers before and had long since stopped finding it either flattering or threatening. "Where are you headed?" Cole asked. "I was going to figure that out when I got here." She said it without apology. "I've got a little money, enough for a few nights somewhere while I find work." "What kind of work?" She looked at him directly. "Any kind that needs doing on a cattle ranch." Cole looked at the envelope in his hand. He hadn't opened it yet and wasn't sure he was going to. Not here. He put it in his coat pocket. "My ranch is about 40 minutes north," he said. "It's in rough shape. I've got 3 full-time hands and work for 6. Fencing that needs to get done before the spring thaw makes it a crisis instead of just a problem. Livestock records that haven't been properly kept in 8 months." He paused. "I'm not offering a permanent position. 30 days, fair wages. Room and board included." Naomi studied him. "Why?" "Because you drove 2 hours to deliver a letter you didn't have to deliver, and you stood there and took what my cousin said without throwing it back at him, and I'm a decent judge of what a person is made of when they're under pressure." He met her eyes. "And because my ranch needs help more than I need my pride." She was quiet for a moment. The platform had mostly cleared around them, the spectacle having wound down to something less entertaining than people had hoped. 30 days, she said. 30 days. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. All right then. The drive to Walker Ranch was mostly quiet. Cole drove with both hands on the wheel the way he always did on roads. He'd driven 10,000 times, and Naomi sat in the passenger seat and looked out at the country unfolding around them. The long, flat stretches giving way to rolling land. The mountains gray and patient in the distance. The sky doing what Montana skies did in March, which was everything at once. She'd asked him one question about 20 minutes in. What's the biggest problem on the ranch right now? He'd thought about it honestly. North fencing, then the cattle records, then the water line to the east pasture that I suspect is compromised, but haven't had time to confirm. In that order? In that order. She'd nodded and gone back to looking out the window, and he'd appreciated that she hadn't tried to fill the silence with reassurances or questions that were really just reassurances in disguise. What he didn't know yet, what he had no way of knowing as he pulled down the long gravel drive toward the ranch house with its peeling porch and its weathered barn and its 240 acres of land that his father had bled for, was that the woman sitting beside him had seen this place before. Not this exact ranch, not these exact buildings, but this kind of sky, this particular quality of light at this time of year, the way the mountains sat at that distance, and the way the wind came down from them in the late afternoon. She'd seen it from a different angle, years ago, in the middle of a fire that had come out of the dry hills so fast that 3 ranches had lost outbuildings before anyone had time to react. And she had pulled a man she'd never met out of a collapsing fence line while smoke turned the afternoon orange and neither of them could breathe properly. And she had dragged him far enough to safety and then disappeared before he regained consciousness because there had been more fire moving and she hadn't had time to wait for thank yous. She didn't know that the man she'd pulled out of that fire was Cole Mercer. She didn't know he'd been looking for her, quietly, for 3 years. She didn't know that he kept half of a burned saddle blanket in a box on the shelf above his desk because it was the only proof he had that the whole thing had actually happened. She was just a woman who'd agreed to 30 days of work on a struggling ranch because the alternative was figuring out something else, and she was tired. And the land out this window looked like something she recognized in a way she couldn't quite explain. The ranch hands met her with varying degrees of skepticism. Tom Briggs, the eldest of the 3, looked her up and down once and said nothing, which Cole had learned over 6 years of working together meant he was reserving judgment, a courtesy he didn't extend to everyone. Pete Yallow shook her hand with genuine curiosity, the kind of openness that came from being 23 and not yet having learned to be strategic about trust. Danny Reeves, who was 41, and had been with Walker Ranch for 9 years and had strong opinions about everything, looked at Cole with an expression that asked several questions simultaneously without requiring words. Cole answered the unspoken question with a look of his own, which communicated, "Let her work. We'll see." Naomi didn't ask for a tour. She asked for the fencing report, whatever existed of one, and spent the first evening at the kitchen table with a map of the property and whatever records Cole had, organizing what she knew from what she'd need to find out. She didn't ask Cole to sit with her. She didn't report back or make promises. She just worked, quietly, until close to midnight. And when she went to bed, she left a single page on the table with the north fence situation diagrammed in handwriting that was plain and precise. Cole found it the next morning with his coffee. The diagram was accurate, more accurate than anything he'd put together himself, and he'd been on that land for 3 years. He stood at the kitchen counter for a long time, looking at it, and then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket and went out to start the day. By the end of the first week, something had shifted on Walker Ranch that Cole couldn't entirely name. Naomi had located 3 breaks in the north fence that weren't on any map. 2 visible ones and one that ran underground through a low section of pasture that flooded every spring and had been slowly eroding a corner post from below. She'd found it by walking the line in the rain at 6 in the morning, boots deep in mud, with a methodology that Pete later described to Cole as like she was listening to the ground. She'd also corrected 8 months of livestock records in 4 evenings, working from receipts and vet records, and the careful notes she made by talking to each hand individually about what they'd actually seen versus what had made it onto paper. When she was done, Cole had a clear picture of his herd for the first time since the previous spring, and the picture was not as bad as he'd feared, which was both a relief and a mild embarrassment, because it meant the anxiety he'd been carrying about the numbers had been based partly on incomplete information. She didn't point that out. She just handed him the corrected ledger and moved on to the waterline. Danny Reeves, who had spent the better part of the first 3 days watching her with the focused suspicion of a man who believed strongly in protecting what he knew, came to Cole on Friday evening and said, in his characteristically direct fashion, "She's good." "Yeah," Cole said. "Where'd she learn it?" "Don't know. Haven't asked." Danny nodded slowly. "You should probably ask." Cole thought about that for a moment. Probably. He hadn't asked, partly because the arrangement was temporary, and asking felt like an investment he hadn't decided to make yet, and partly because Naomi moved through the ranch with such complete self-sufficiency that asking felt like interrupting something that was functioning without his input. But Danny was right. He should probably ask. He asked on Saturday evening. They were both at the fence line. He'd come out to check the progress on the corner post repair and found her already there, not repairing it but standing near it with her arms folded, watching the water level in the low ground with the expression of someone calculating something. "Where did you learn to read land like this?" he said. She glanced at him. "My father's ranch. New Mexico, originally. Then Wyoming after he remarried. You ran it with him?" "I ran it for him mostly. He had a bad back from the time I was 12. She paused. "He left the ranch to my stepbrother when he died. Legally arranged well in advance. Nothing I could do about it." Cole said nothing for a moment. "That's a hard thing?" "It was." She said it simply, without drama. "I worked 2 other ranches after that, learned different things from each of them, ended up in Denver for a few months trying to figure out the next step." She looked back at the water. "That's where I was when I met Clara Hutchins, on that platform." The wind came down from the mountains, cold and clean, and somewhere across the pasture one of the horses made a sound that carried clearly in the evening quiet. "What was she like?" Cole asked. "Clara." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "Scared," she said finally. "But kind. She felt terrible about what she was doing. She cried for about 20 minutes on that platform, which is why I offered to take the letter. I thought if she didn't have to worry about it, she'd feel like she could go home without it being the worst thing she'd ever done." Cole looked at the mountains. "Did it help?" "I think so. A little." Naomi unfolded her arms. "She said you wrote good letters." Cole didn't say anything to that. "She said you were honest," Naomi continued. "That you never pretended the ranch was something it wasn't, and you never pretended you were something you weren't." She paused. That was the thing she found the most frightening, actually. She'd been lied to before, in her marriage. Honesty felt more dangerous to her than a comfortable lie would have. Cole absorbed that quietly. There wasn't anything useful to say about it, so he didn't say anything. "I'm sorry it didn't work out," Naomi said. "For what it's worth." "Yeah." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "Me too." The low ground was still holding more water than it should. Naomi looked at it for another moment and then said, "That post is going to keep failing unless we regrade this section. It's not a repair problem, it's a drainage problem." "I know." "Do you have the equipment for it?" "Tom does. We can borrow it." She nodded, still looking at the ground. "We should do it before the next rain." Agreed. They stood there together for another minute in the kind of silence that had stopped being uncomfortable sometime in the middle of the week, and then they walked back toward the barn in the failing light, and neither of them said anything more. And Cole thought about what she'd said about honesty feeling more dangerous than a comfortable lie. He'd spent enough time alone to understand exactly what Clara Hutchins had meant. He just wasn't sure yet what he was going to do about the fact that understanding it didn't change anything. Grant Mercer drove up on Sunday afternoon unannounced, which was his preferred method of arrival at Cole's ranch, because announced visits gave Cole time to prepare, and Grant had always preferred catching people off guard. He pulled up in his truck while Naomi was in the yard working with one of the younger horses, a 3-year-old sorrel mare that had been badly spooked by something the previous fall and hadn't fully trusted anyone since. Naomi wasn't forcing anything. She was just standing near the mare, moving slowly, talking in a low, continuous voice that Cole, watching from the porch, couldn't make out but could tell was doing something because the mare's ears were moving differently than they did with anyone else. Grant got out of his truck and watched her for a moment with his hands on his hips. "Still here, I see," he called to Cole. Cole leaned against the porch rail. "What do you need, Grant?" Just checking in on my cousin. Grant walked up toward the porch but kept glancing back at Naomi and the horse. Heard in town you've got your train station mistake doing ranch work. She's doing ranch work, Cole said flatly. That's accurate. People are talking, Cole. People can talk. Grant smiled the smile. They're saying you're trying to make it look like you've got a wife so the ranch inheritance looks more stable. You know Dad's old will had that clause. I know what the will says. Well, Grant spread his hands. I'm just saying, the appearance of things matters. And right now the appearance is you brought a woman home who isn't what you advertised. I didn't advertise anything. The letters, Cole. 11 months of letters to a woman you never met. That's a kind of advertisement. Grant glanced back at Naomi again. The mare had lowered her head. And now you've got, whatever that is, living on your property, and people are drawing conclusions. Cole pushed off the rail and straightened to his full height. What conclusions would you like them to draw, Grant? Something sharpened behind Grant's smile. I'd like them to draw accurate ones. Then they should come out here and watch her work, Cole said, because she's the most accurate thing on this property right now. Grant held the smile for another 3 seconds, then let it drift into something colder and less performative. You know the estate review is coming up in 60 days. I know. Dad's executor doesn't have any patience for gray areas. Then he won't find any, Cole said, because there aren't any. Grant looked at him for a long moment, then looked back at Naomi and the horse, who were now standing close enough that the mare's nose was almost touching Naomi's shoulder. He got back in his truck. He didn't say goodbye. He never did when the visit hadn't gone the way he'd planned. Cole watched him drive away down the gravel road and felt the familiar cold weight of the situation settle more firmly into his chest. 60 days. An estate review. Grant circling like something patient and calculating, waiting for a mistake he could leverage. He looked out at the yard where Naomi was now running a slow hand along the mare's neck, the horse standing absolutely still beneath the touch. 30 days, he'd said. He was already calculating whether 30 days was going to be enough. The regrading of the low section near the north fence took 2 days, which was 1 day longer than Naomi had estimated, and half a day shorter than Cole had privately expected. Tom Briggs ran the borrowed grader with the careful precision of a man who had been doing one thing well for 30 years and had no interest in doing it faster than it ought to be done. Naomi walked beside the work, marking grades with a stick and a string level she'd found hanging in the barn, and Cole watched from a distance for the first hour before deciding he was more useful as a third set of hands than as an observer and coming down to help. They didn't talk much while they worked. That was something Cole had noticed about Naomi in the first week. She didn't use words as filler. When she spoke, she meant it, and when she was quiet, she was thinking, and knowing the difference made it possible to be next to her for 8 hours without feeling either talked at or ignored. By late afternoon on the second day, the drainage was running correctly for the first time in at least 2 seasons. Cole could tell because the standing water that had pooled in that corner every time it rained had somewhere to go now, and the corner posts sat in ground that would actually dry out instead of slowly drowning. Tom shut off the grader and climbed down with the careful movements of a man whose knees had been having opinions about ladders for several years. He looked at the finished grade, walked it for 30 feet, then came back. Good, he said, which from Tom Briggs was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Naomi was wiping mud off her forearms with a rag that had already given up on being clean. She looked at the drainage line and nodded once, the particular nod of someone checking a calculation against a result. The east line is next, she said to Cole. I know. The water pressure issue you mentioned, I want to look at the line itself before we assume it's a break. Could be partial blockage at the junction. Easier fix if it is. Could be, Cole agreed. He was looking at the corner post, which was holding properly now, which should have been a straightforward satisfaction, and was, mostly, except that it also made him think about everything else on the property that had been declining slowly enough that he'd stopped seeing it clearly. How'd you know the drainage was the problem? Before you'd even walked the line? Naomi looked at him. The grass pattern, the way the water stained the lower boards on that post, and the way the soil around the base was a different color than it should have been, which means it hadn't been dry long enough in recent seasons to oxidize properly. She paused. My father had a section like this on his New Mexico property. I watched him patch the post 4 times before I figured out it wasn't a post problem. How old were you? 14. Cole thought about being 14 and figuring out drainage problems. He'd been 14 and mostly concerned with avoiding his cousin Grant at family events, which had been its own kind of education. Your father teach you the rest of it? He asked. The record keeping, the herd management. Some of it. She started walking back toward the gate. The rest I learned by making mistakes on other people's ranches and being honest about it afterward. Cole fell into step beside her. What kind of mistakes? She was quiet for a beat. I pushed a herd too hard during a dry summer on a ranch in Wyoming. Thought I knew the water situation better than I did. Lost 4 head. She said it directly, the way you say something you've already made your peace with but haven't forgotten. The owner didn't fire me. I thought he might. Instead, he sat me down and walked me through every decision I'd made and where each one had gone wrong, and he didn't make it about blame, he made it about understanding. A brief pause. That was more useful than being fired would have been. Who was he? Man named Garrett Holt. Had a place outside Sheridan. She glanced at Cole sideways. He died 2 years after that. Heart attack. His family sold the ranch. I'm sorry. Me too. She said it plainly. He was the kind of man who made you want to be better at the thing you were doing. You don't run into that very often. Cole thought of his father, who had been exactly that kind of man, and who had also died too soon, and he didn't say anything about it because it wasn't the moment, and because some things you carried quietly rather than putting them into conversation. They reached the gate. Tom had already driven the grader back toward the barn. Pete was somewhere along the east fence line, and Danny had gone into town for supplies that morning and hadn't come back yet, which probably meant he'd run into someone he knew, which always extended the errand by at least an hour. Naomi, Cole said. She stopped with her hand on the gate latch. The 30 days, he said. I want to revisit that. She turned and looked at him. Her expression didn't change much, but something in it became more careful. In what direction? Not in any direction yet, he said. I just want to say that the conversation is one I'd like to have before the 30 days are up, rather than at the end of them. She looked at him for a moment, assessing. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when she was filing something accurately rather than agreeing to something emotionally. All right, she said, and opened the gate. I wasn't sure if that was a yes or a maybe, or just an acknowledgement that he'd spoken, and he suspected she knew that he wasn't sure, and he let it sit there rather than pushing it, because there were things on this ranch that needed time to settle into the right shape, and he was learning that Naomi Cross was probably one of them. The ride back to the house was quiet, in a way that felt different from the quiet of the first week, less cautious, more established, like two people who had been practicing a language separately and were beginning to realize they'd been learning the same one. What Cole didn't notice was the truck parked on the road a quarter-mile south of the property, idling with its lights off in the early dusk. Grant Mercer had a pair of binoculars and a particular expression that people who underestimate their relatives tend to wear when they realize too late that they've been wrong about something. He sat there for another 10 minutes, watching the lights come on in the ranch house windows, and then he made a phone call. The voice on the other end was the estate's legal executor, a careful man named Harold Finch, who was paid to be thorough and who had, over the course of a long career, seen every variety of family dispute that money and land could produce. I need to talk to you about the Walker Ranch review, Grant said. I have some concerns about the living situation up there. There was a pause on the line. What kind of concerns? Grant watched the ranch house windows. The kind that might affect the validity of the estate distribution. I think Cole might be trying to manufacture a domestic arrangement for legal purposes. Another pause. That's a significant allegation. I know what I saw, Grant said. I need to know what documentation you'd need to investigate it. Harold Finch was quiet for a moment, in the way that careful men are quiet when they're deciding how far they're willing to go. Come to my office Thursday morning, he said finally. We'll discuss what the estate documentation actually requires. Grant hung up and drove away without his lights on until he was well past the property line, which was a small precaution that said something specific about how he'd decided to conduct himself going forward. He wasn't wrong that Cole was trying to save the ranch. He was wrong about the rest of it, but he didn't know that yet, and knowing it wouldn't have changed his approach regardless. Grant Mercer was the kind of man who didn't need to believe he was right. He just needed to believe he could win. The days that followed had a rhythm that hadn't existed on Walker Ranch in at least 2 years. Naomi found the waterline problem at the East Junction on her first morning of looking. It was a partial blockage, as she'd suspected, sediment built up at the elbow joint where the line had been poorly fitted during a repair sometime before Cole had inherited the property. Pete Yallow helped her dig it out, and Cole came by in the afternoon to find the east pasture troughs running properly for the first time since the previous autumn, and 3 of the cattle had already found their way to them with the particular purposeful satisfaction of animals who'd been making do with inadequate water and had not forgotten what adequate water felt like. "That was the repair before mine?" Cole asked, looking at the badly fitted joint they'd dug out. "Whoever did it used the wrong size connector," Naomi said. "Forced it, worked for a while, then started restricting." Cole turned the old connector in his hands. It was the kind of error that someone in a hurry makes, someone who's trying to fix a problem fast rather than correctly. He had a feeling he knew who'd done the original repair. A hired hand who'd left the ranch 2 months before his father died, under circumstances Cole had never fully investigated because there had been too many other things demanding his attention. He was starting to understand that a lot of things on this ranch had been left half-examined for the same reason. "You all right?" Naomi asked. He looked up. She was watching him with that direct, patient gaze that he was becoming accustomed to and simultaneously never quite prepared for. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking." "About?" He set the connector down. "About how many things got neglected because I was managing the grief of inheriting them." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "That's an honest thing to say." "It's an honest situation." She looked at the troughs, where a 4th cow had now appeared and was drinking with focused intent. "My father was sick for 2 years before he died," she said. "I managed the ranch through all of it, and by the time he was gone, I'd made so many decisions in crisis mode that I couldn't tell anymore which ones were good decisions and which ones were just decisions I'd made because something had to be decided." She paused. "It took me a long time to sort that out." Cole looked at her. "Did you?" "Mostly." A slight dry quality entered her voice that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "The ones I got wrong, I at least understand now." Cole nodded slowly. He filed that away the way he'd been filing things about Naomi Cross all week, carefully, in a place he'd know where to find it later. What happened 2 days after that was not something he'd filed away. It was something that changed the shape of things in a way he was still processing a week later when he thought back on it. Danny Reeves came back from his second trip to town with supplies and a look on his face that Cole had seen before. A contained, measured concern that Danny wore when something had gone wrong in the way that things go wrong quietly before they go wrong loudly. "Heard something in town," Danny said. He waited until Naomi was in the barn with Pete before he said the rest. "Grant's been talking to Harold Finch." Cole went very still. "When?" "Thursday morning, from what I hear. Berta Cannon saw Grant's truck outside Finch's office. She mentioned it at the feed store this afternoon." Berta Cannon saw everything in Crestfall and mentioned most of it, which was a quality that Cole had found alternately useful and exhausting over the years, and which was now presenting as the former. "What kind of talking?" Cole said. Danny's jaw worked for a moment. "Kind that has to do with the estate review and your living situation." He met Cole's eyes directly. "Grant's telling people you're manufacturing a domestic arrangement for legal benefit, that Naomi's not what she appears to be." Cole didn't say anything for a moment. The evening wind came across the yard and moved through the trees near the barn, and somewhere inside Pete was saying something to Naomi in the patient, slightly reverent tone he'd been using with her since the second day, when she'd shown him how to properly read a herd's water consumption against pasture condition. "He say anything specific?" Cole asked. "That she showed up instead of your bride and you took her in, and now you're using her presence to make it look like you've got a stable domestic situation for the inheritance review." Danny paused. "He's not entirely wrong about the sequence of events. He's entirely wrong about everything else." "I know that, but Finch doesn't, and Finch is the one who matters." Cole looked at the barn. Through the open door he could see Naomi crouched near the sorrel mare's front leg. The horse had caught itself on something in the pasture that afternoon. Nothing serious, but Naomi had been checking it twice daily since it happened with the careful attention of someone who knew that small injuries go bad through neglect rather than severity. "I need to talk to her," Cole said. "Yeah," Danny said. "You do." He waited until Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and the barn was quiet. Naomi was finishing her notes from the evening check. She kept a small notebook, handwritten, with observations about each animal that she updated every day. And Cole had looked at it once when she'd left it on the kitchen table and had felt the particular quality of competence that comes from watching someone be very good at something you understand well enough to recognize. "We need to talk about Grant," he said. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing, then she closed the notebook and looked at him. "I figured. He's been talking to the estate executor, making a case that our arrangement is fraudulent, that I'm using your presence here to create a false impression of domestic stability for the inheritance review." Naomi held his gaze. "And what does the inheritance review actually require?" "Nothing specific about marital status. But the estate clause my uncle wrote before he died specifies that the ranch should pass to the Mercer family member who demonstrates, and this is the language, responsible stewardship and personal stability." He paused. "Grant's been unmarried and between properties for 2 years. I've been here, working the ranch. Legally, I'm in a stronger position. But if he can create doubt about my stability, about my honesty, he can muddy the water enough to get a second look," Naomi finished. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted in her stall and the barn settled around them with the small sounds of an old building at rest. "What are you asking me?" Naomi said. "I'm not asking you anything yet," Cole said. "I'm telling you what's happening so you understand the situation you're in. Because you're in it whether you knew you were walking into it or not, and you deserve to have that information." She looked at him for a long moment. Most people would have led with the ask. "I'm not most people." "No," she said slowly. "You're not." Another silence. Naomi put her notebook in her coat pocket. "I'm not going to lie to anyone," she said. "Not to Finch, not to a judge, not to the county. If someone asks me what I'm doing here, I'll tell them exactly what I'm doing here, working a ranch for fair wages on a 30-day arrangement. That's the truth and I'm comfortable with it." "That's all I'd ask," Cole said. "The truth is actually fine. The truth is that you've done more for this ranch in 2 weeks than it's had done for it in 2 years, and anyone who wants to investigate that is welcome to." Something moved in Naomi's expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it, a recognition. "Grant's going to push harder," she said. "You know that. I know. And it might get uncomfortable, for me personally. He's the kind of man who goes after the weakest point in a structure. I know that too. And you think I'm the weakest point?" "I think he thinks you are," Cole said carefully. "Which isn't the same thing." Naomi absorbed that. She looked at the mare for a moment, then back at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay? I'm not leaving because Grant Mercer decided I'm useful to attack." She said it simply, without drama, the way she said most things. "If he wants to make a case, he can make one. I've got nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of." Cole let out a slow breath he hadn't entirely realized he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said. She shook her head slightly, dismissing the thanks. "Don't thank me. I'm staying because the east pasture water situation isn't fully resolved, and Danny's pretty sure the southeast fence needs inspection before spring, and I'm not the kind of person who leaves a job half done." She picked up her jacket from the stall rail. The fact that it also happens to be inconvenient for Grant Mercer is just a bonus. Cole almost smiled. It happened before he could prevent it, which was something he'd been noticing about himself lately. That certain things Naomi said or did produced reactions in him that occurred slightly ahead of his ability to manage them. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He was getting a clearer sense, though, that he was going to have to figure it out. The community of Crestfall had approximately 2,200 residents and an information network that functioned with a speed and accuracy that several newspapers might have envied. By the end of the following week, the story of Naomi Cross at Walker Ranch had been discussed at the feed store, the diner on Route 9, 2 different church parking lots, and the monthly meeting of the Crestfall Cattlemen's Association, which Cole was obligated to attend, and at which he discovered that community opinion on the matter was more divided than Grant had apparently calculated. Margaret Holt, who was 73 and had been ranching the same property since before Cole was born, cornered him near the coffee table before the meeting started. "That woman's staying on your place," she said, without preamble, because Margaret Holt was a person who believed in getting directly to whatever she intended to get to. "I heard she fixed your east water line." She did, Cole said. And the north fence drainage. That too. Margaret looked at him with eyes that had spent 7 decades evaluating people and things and had gotten very accurate at it. Grant's saying she's a fraud. Grant's saying a lot of things. Yes, he is. She picked up her coffee cup. Grant has always said a lot of things, most of them in his own interest. A pause. I'd like to meet her. Cole looked at her. I can arrange that. Do. She moved away toward her chair with the decisive movement of a woman who has made her point and sees no reason to expand on it. The meeting itself was routine until the last 15 minutes, when Grant, who had not been on the association list but had clearly arranged to be there, raised what he called a concern about transparency within the ranching community that was specifically, if not explicitly, about Cole's situation. He framed it carefully. No direct accusations, just questions about what standards the community held for the estate review process, whether personal arrangements should be scrutinized for authenticity, whether it was in the community's interest to ensure that inheritance decisions were made on honest grounds. It was well constructed. Cole had to give him that. Bill Tarrant, who was 60 and had known both Mercer cousins since they were boys, cut through it with the bluntness of a man who'd run out of patience for implications sometime in his 40s. Grant, he said from his chair in the middle of the room, are you saying Cole's doing something dishonest? Or are you just arranging words in a way that suggests it without committing to it? A ripple of quiet movement went through the room. Grant smiled his careful smile. I'm raising questions that I think the executor should be asking. Then raise them with the executor, Bill said. That's what he's for. Grant looked around the room, gauging. What he saw was not what he'd hoped for. A few faces nodding with him, more faces carefully neutral, and several faces like Bill's and Margaret's that were looking at him with the specific expression of people who had known him long enough to factor in his track record. He sat down. Cole drove home that night in the dark, and the thing he kept thinking about wasn't Grant's performance, or the community's mixed response, or even Harold Finch's likely next move. He kept thinking about what Naomi had said about staying because the job wasn't finished. He kept thinking about it because it was the most practical possible reason to stay, and it was also, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, the thing that had made him trust her more than anything else she'd done or said. He pulled up to the ranch house and sat in the truck for a moment. The kitchen light was on, which meant Naomi was still up. She kept later hours than the hands, usually reading or going over her notes, sometimes just sitting with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table in the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be comfortable with their own company. He went in. She was at the table with her notebook open. She looked up when he came in, reading his expression the way she read a fence line, for information, not for comfort. How'd it go? She asked. Grant showed up at the meeting, he said. He sat down across from her without taking his coat off. Made his case without quite making it. Naomi's jaw tightened slightly. What did the room do? Split. More than he expected, I think. Less than I'd have liked. He looked at his hands on the table. Margaret Holt wants to meet you. I know Margaret Holt, Naomi said. Cole looked up. How? She and Garrett Holt were cousins. He mentioned her. Naomi paused. He spoke highly of her. Cole absorbed that quietly. The way people kept appearing connected in this story in ways that weren't visible until you looked from the right angle, like a fence line that seems straight until the light catches it differently. She'd probably speak for you, he said. If it came to that. It might come to that. Naomi said it without alarm. Grant's not going to stop. No. And Finch is going to want something more than our word. Probably. She looked at him steadily. What would help most right now? Cole thought about it honestly. Documentation of what you've actually done here. Hours, tasks, outcomes. Something I can put in front of Finch and say, this is the work. This is the result. This is what the ranch looks like now compared to before. Naomi turned to a fresh page in her notebook. I can write that up, she said. 2 days. You don't have to. I keep records anyway. She said it simply. I'll just organize them in a way that's useful for Finch rather than just for me. Cole watched her start writing. Neat, careful handwriting, the kind that meant she was thinking clearly and not in a hurry. There's something I should tell you, he said. She kept writing. All right. Grant isn't just doing this because of the inheritance, Cole said. He owes money, real money, to people who aren't patient. I don't know the whole of it, but I know enough. If he gets the ranch, it solves his immediate problem." He paused. "Which means he's not going to stop at raising questions. He's going to escalate." Naomi's pen slowed but didn't stop. She finished the word she was writing. Then she set the pen down and looked at him. "How far do you think he'll go?" she said. Cole met her eyes. "Far enough that I need you to know it's coming, so you're not blindsided." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming from the north with the edge that meant the temperature was dropping again, and the old ranch house made the small sounds it made when the temperature changed. Boards settling, metal contracting, the particular creak in the back hallway that Cole had heard so many times he'd stopped registering it. "I've been blindsided before," Naomi said finally. "When my father's will was read and I found out what it said, I'd had no warning at all, not even a hint." She picked up her pen again. "This is different. You're telling me. That matters." Cole didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, and Naomi went back to writing, and they sat there together in the kitchen with the wind outside and the light on between them, and neither of them was pretending that everything was fine, which was maybe the most important thing. Grant made his next move 4 days later. He didn't come himself. He sent a woman named Deborah Silks, who worked as a freelance legal researcher and who showed up at the Walker Ranch gate on a Tuesday morning and announced that she was conducting an inquiry on behalf of Harold Finch's office regarding the estate review, and that she needed to speak with everyone currently residing on the property. Cole let her in. He had nothing to hide, and he knew that the decision to refuse access would be used against him regardless of his reasons for refusing. Deborah Silks was thorough. She interviewed Tom Briggs, Pete Yallow, and Danny Reeves separately, each in the small room off the kitchen that Cole used as an office. She took notes by hand on a yellow legal pad. She asked about the ranch's operational status, about management decisions, about who was giving direction and who was following it. She asked each of the hands the same question, in different forms. "Would you characterize the arrangement between Cole Mercer and Naomi Cross as a genuine working relationship or something else?" Tom Briggs's answer was 3 words. "She does the work." Pete Yallow's answer was longer, delivered with the earnest specificity of a 23-year-old who did not understand that he was being navigated, and who therefore simply answered the question directly and completely, describing in detailed and unprompted terms the state of the ranch before Naomi's arrival and the state of it now, including specific examples, specific outcomes, and his own opinion, freely offered, that she was "the best judge of cattle water I've ever seen on a working property, and I grew up on one." Danny Reeves looked at Deborah Silks for a long moment before he answered anything. Then he said, "You want to know about the work? I'll tell you about the work. You want to know about anything else? You talk to Cole." She then interviewed Naomi, who sat across from her at the kitchen table with the same steady, direct quality that she brought to everything, and answered every question with complete factual accuracy and zero performance. She described her background, her experience, the specific tasks she'd undertaken at Walker Ranch, and the outcomes of each. Deborah Silks asked, "How would you characterize your personal relationship with Mr. Mercer?" Naomi said, "Professional. We're employer and employee. 30-day arrangement, fair wages, room and board. I'm doing a job that needed doing." "Nothing more?" Naomi looked at her evenly. "Nothing I'd call more? No." It was true. It was completely true. And it was also, in some way that Naomi was only beginning to acknowledge to herself in the quiet of her own thinking, not the complete picture of what was happening in the kitchen on the evenings when she and Cole sat across from each other and talked about the ranch, and about their lives, and about the land outside the window that had started to feel, to Naomi, in some way that alarmed her precisely because of how quietly it had happened, like something she recognized. After Deborah Silks left, Cole came and found Naomi at the barn, where she was doing a routine check of the sorrel mare's leg, which had healed cleanly enough that the morning visits had been downgraded to every other day. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I told her the truth," Naomi said. "All of it?" She looked at the mare's leg, running 2 fingers along the healed cut. "All of the relevant part." Cole stood for a moment. He didn't push it. He'd learned not to push with her. Not because she was fragile, she was about as far from fragile as a person could get, but because she moved through things at the speed of her own understanding, and trying to move her faster didn't accelerate anything, it just created friction. The southeast fence needs looking at this week, he said. I know, Thursday. I'll come with you. She looked up at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He held her gaze. I want to. Something shifted in her expression, small and quick, and then carefully arranged back into neutrality. But he'd seen it. Thursday, then, she said. She turned back to the mare, and Cole went back toward the house, and neither of them said anything else, and the ranch went about its afternoon with the steady indifference of land and animals that don't track the interior lives of the people who work them. But something had been said, in the way that things get said between two people who are both paying careful attention and both pretending, with varying degrees of success, that they aren't. Grant's next move arrived not as a person or a legal inquiry, but as a story. It appeared first at the diner on Route 9, and then at the feed store, and then, with the speed that stories achieve when they have enough detail to seem credible, across most of the county. The story was that Naomi Cross had a history of inserting herself into struggling ranches, gaining the trust of the owner, and then either leaving with something valuable or manufacturing situations that benefited her at the owner's expense. The story was completely fabricated, but it had enough structural plausibility. A woman who showed up at a vulnerable moment, who had no local history, who had gained significant authority on the property quickly, that it found traction in exactly the places it was designed to find it. Cole heard it from Pete on a Wednesday morning, who heard it from someone at the hardware store, who'd heard it from someone whose name he couldn't remember. Cole stood in the yard after Pete told him, and was quiet for long enough that Pete started to look concerned. You okay? Pete asked. Yeah. Cole's voice was flat in a way that meant he was making a decision. Where's Naomi? North fence, finishing the last section check before her report. Cole walked to the north fence. She was there, kneeling near the final post, making a note in her book. She looked up when she heard him coming, and she read his expression in about 3 seconds. What happened? She said. He told her. He told her all of it, every version he knew, directly and without softening it. Naomi listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. He made that up, she said. I know. Completely. I've never... She stopped, looked at the post, then back at him. I've never done anything like what he's describing. I know that, Cole said. I don't need you to convince me. She looked at him. Something in her face had tightened in a way he hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but something close to it, the controlled version of it, the kind that takes more effort to hold than to release. He's not going to stop, she said. No. And this is going to get worse before it gets better. Probably. She stood up. She was close to his height, and she met his eyes without the slight upward tilt that most people used when they spoke to him. Cole, I need to ask you something straight. Okay. Do you trust me? He didn't hesitate. Yes. She held his gaze for another moment, checking it the way she checked everything. Not for reassurance, but for accuracy. Then she nodded. Then let him keep talking, she said, because everything he's saying is false, and false things don't hold up to the kind of scrutiny this is going to get. She bent and picked up her notebook. Let him make his case. Let him bring it to Finch, to a judge, to whoever he wants to bring it to. She met his eyes one more time. And then let's show them what actually happened here. Cole looked at her, at the mud on her boots, and the notebook in her hand, and the particular, exhausted certainty in her face of a person who has been underestimated enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. Okay, he said. It was the same word she'd given him 2 weeks ago, at the gate in the evening light. The same word with the same weight. She nodded once and walked back toward the ranch house, and Cole stood at the north fence line that she'd fixed and looked at the mountains in the distance and felt the particular quality of cold determination that comes when you've decided, without reservation, which side of something you're on. The storm, when it came, would find him standing in the same place. The southeast fence inspection on Thursday went the way most honest jobs go. It took longer than expected and turned up more than either of them had planned for. Cole had thought it would be a half-day walk. It became a full day. The southeast line ran through terrain that dropped twice into shallow ravines before climbing back up toward the ridge, and what looked manageable from a map was considerably less manageable on foot in early April, when the ground was still deciding between frozen and thawed and hadn't fully committed to either. Naomi walked it systematically, the way she walked everything, not fast, but without wasted motion. Cole matched her pace and watched her process, the way she'd stop at intervals and run her eye along the line rather than just looking at the post in front of her, checking the whole thing rather than the individual points. They found 6 sections that needed work. 2 were minor. 3 were significant. 1. Near the second ravine, where the soil had shifted over the winter and taken a corner post slightly with it, was the kind of problem that looks manageable and becomes a crisis the first time a bull decides to test it. That one first, Naomi said, looking at the leaning post. Agreed. She crouched and dug her fingers into the soil near the base, feeling the give of it. Cole watched her. She had a way of touching the land that was neither delicate nor rough, the same way she handled the horses, actually, present, purposeful. Frost heave, she said. The whole base shifted. We'll need to reset it, not just brace it. How long? She looked at the ravine, then back at the post. Half a day if the ground cooperates. Full day if it doesn't. Cole looked at the sky. The clouds to the northwest had the color and weight of something that meant business, and the business they meant was probably precipitation. We've got maybe 2 days before rain. Then we do it tomorrow, Naomi said, straightening. Early. They ate lunch sitting on a flat rock above the second ravine, sandwiches that Cole had made that morning because it was his turn, which had been established somewhere around the second week without either of them formally establishing it. The sandwiches were adequate. Cole was a functional cook, not an inspired one, and the ham was slightly heavy on the mustard, but Naomi ate hers without comment, which he'd come to understand was how she registered that something was fine, rather than how she registered that she didn't notice. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked at him. You can ask. What were you planning? Before Denver, before the train? She looked out over the ravine. Below, a narrow creek ran silver in the pale light. I had an offer in Colorado, ranch management position, proper one. Good wages, decent housing, outside of Pueblo. She paused. I was going to take it. What changed? Nothing changed, she said. I was on my way to confirm it when I ran into Clara on that platform. She was quiet for a moment. I could still take it. The offer's open for another few weeks. Cole looked at her. She was still watching the creek below, and her voice had been perfectly level when she said it, but he had the specific feeling of someone who has stepped onto ground they assumed was solid and felt it give slightly under their weight. Is that something you're considering? He said. She turned and looked at him. I don't know yet. He held her gaze for a moment. That's a straight answer. You asked a straight question. He looked back out at the ravine. The creek moved through the rocks below with a sound he could almost but not quite hear from this distance, and the clouds to the northwest had moved closer in the time they'd been sitting there, which meant tomorrow was going to be a race. What would make you decide one way or the other? He said. Naomi was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, whether what I'm doing here matters beyond 30 days. Cole thought about that carefully. I think it does, he said. I think you know it does. What I know, Naomi said, and what I'm able to rely on are 2 different things. I've known things about places before and been wrong about whether they were mine to rely on. She meant her father's ranch. He understood that. He didn't push it. They walked back to the house in the late afternoon with the sky pressing lower from the northwest, and the cold that came with it had real intention behind it, and neither of them said much the rest of the way. But the silence was the kind that holds something rather than the kind that avoids it. It was 2 days after that when Naomi found the saddle blanket. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been looking for a spare cinch ring that Pete had mentioned seeing somewhere in the back storage room off the main barn, a narrow room that had served as a catch-all for decades, and which contained, in no particular order, broken equipment, retired tack, 3 boxes of records from the 1990s that Cole had been meaning to go through for 2 years, several items of clothing that appeared to belong to no one currently living on the property, and various other things that accumulate in old buildings when nobody gets around to clearing them out. She'd found the cinch ring on a hook near the door. She'd been on her way back out when something caught her eye on the shelf to the left. It was folded and placed with a deliberateness that stood out from the general disorder of the room. Not dusty, like everything else, or not as dusty, which meant it had been handled more recently. A piece of fabric. Wool, hand-stitched, in a pattern of dark red and brown and black that had been burned along one edge and along most of one side, The fiber fused and blackened and stopping abruptly where whoever had folded it to hide nothing, just to contain it. She picked it up. Her hands knew what it was before her mind finished the question. She stood in the storage room with the burned piece of saddle blanket in her hands, and the cold of the room, and the smell of old leather, and the cinch ring in her other hand, and the memory came back with the physical weight that certain memories have. Not like recalling a story, but like something that had been stored in her body rather than her head. The fire had started on the ridge above the Harmon property, which was 12 miles from where she'd been working at the time, on a dry August afternoon when the wind was coming from the wrong direction at the wrong speed. She'd seen the smoke from the pasture where she was working a young horse, and she'd known immediately that it was moving too fast, and that someone needed to know about it, and that the someone in this particular stretch of country was probably her, since the nearest neighbor was a mile and a half away and she was already on a horse. She'd ridden toward it instead of away, which she'd known at the time was probably not the decision a reasonable person would make, and which she'd made anyway, because the smoke was coming down toward a fence line where she'd seen someone working earlier in the day, and she couldn't leave without knowing. She'd found him down in a section of burned fence where a post had fallen and caught him across the back of the legs, and the smoke had gotten to him enough that he couldn't clear his head to get out from under it. He was conscious when she found him, but not fully, saying something she couldn't understand, coughing, trying to get his hands under himself. She'd gotten the post off him with a fence bar she'd found nearby. It had taken her 3 attempts and wrenched something in her shoulder that had bothered her for 6 months after. She'd half dragged, half walked him away from the burning fence line, 200 feet uphill through smoke that made her eyes water until she couldn't see, until they were clear of the immediate fire path, and she'd left him propped against a juniper tree, conscious enough to stay upright, and she'd gone back for the horse, and the saddle blanket she'd pulled off to use as ground cover, and had taken the half of it that wasn't burned because the other half was fused into the ground, and she had more fire to deal with and 2 other properties to check. And she'd told herself she'd come back to find out who he was, and she hadn't, because the fire had run 4 more miles before it was contained. And by the time it was over, there were 3 ranches with partial damage and 1 with total damage, and she'd been working alongside a volunteer crew for 18 hours. And by the time she stopped, she was in a different county, and the moment for going back had passed. She'd thought about him sometimes, wondered if he'd been all right. She had not, in her most elaborate imagining, pictured herself standing in his storage room 3 years later, holding the other half of the saddle blanket. She stood there for a long time, long enough that the light in the small room changed, which meant time was passing that she wasn't tracking. Then she put the blanket carefully back on the shelf, exactly as she'd found it, and walked out of the storage room and stood in the barn with the cinch ring in her hand, and her heart doing something loud and complicated that she was not ready to examine in detail. Pete came through the barn about 10 minutes later and found her standing near the sorrel mare's stall. "You find it?" he said. "The cinch ring." She held it up. "Good." He took it and moved on, cheerfully oblivious, and Naomi stood there for another moment before she made herself move. She went through the rest of the day doing the things that needed doing. The mare's check, a look at the water pressure in the east trough, a review of the weekly feed calculations that she'd been keeping separate from the main records for her own clarity. She did all of it with the outward steadiness that she'd developed over years of working in situations that required her to stay functional, regardless of what was happening inside. But her mind kept going back to the shelf in that storage room. The man on the ground, the smoke, the post, the weight of him when she'd gotten him upright and moving. She hadn't seen his face clearly. The smoke had been too thick and she'd been focused on the practical problem, which was moving him rather than cataloging him. She knew he'd been tall. She knew he'd been broad through the shoulders. She knew his voice, even blurred by smoke and semi-consciousness, had been low. A quiet voice, not a loud one. She'd thought about that voice once or twice, in the years since, without intending to. She did not say anything to Cole that evening. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and looked at the week's fence report and thought about how you tell someone something like this, or whether you tell them at all, or whether she was even certain enough to say anything yet. She was almost certain. She was not completely certain, and she was not the kind of person who said almost. She went to bed that night and looked at the ceiling for a long time, and the ceiling gave her nothing useful, which was what ceilings generally did. The next morning, she went back to the storage room before anyone else was up. She took the burned saddle blanket from the shelf and brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table under the light. In the better light, she could see the stitching more clearly. A particular diamond pattern in the dark red, alternating with a cross-stitch in black, that she remembered her own grandmother doing on a piece of work she'd kept for years before it fell apart. Not the same stitching, but the same hand that she was looking for. The diamond pattern, the specific angle of the intersections, the slight irregularity in the fourth row that appeared at intervals. She'd made that blanket herself. She'd made it when she was 22, working her first job on her own, buying the wool with money she'd saved specifically for it because she'd wanted something she'd made that would last. She'd used it on every saddle for 4 years until the fire. And after the fire, she'd had the half that wasn't burned, and she'd kept it for a year before she lost it in a move and hadn't had the heart to replace it. There was no question. This was the other half. She was sitting at the table with both hands flat on the burned wool when she heard Cole's boots on the back porch. The particular sound of him, which she had learned the way you learn the sounds of a house you've been living in, not deliberately, but inevitably. He came in and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the blanket on the table. His face did something she had never seen it do. A slow, complete revision of his expression, as if the face he'd been wearing had been built for a different room and the room had just changed. He sat down slowly across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Where did you find it?" he said. His voice was careful in a way that it never was. "Storage room," she said. "I was looking for a cinch ring." He looked at the blanket. He reached out and touched the burned edge, just the edge, with 2 fingers. Then he looked up at her. "There's a fire," he said. It wasn't a question. He was starting from the beginning, she understood, making sure he was reading the right thing. "August, 3 years ago." "August," she confirmed. 3 years ago. He was very still. "I was working a fence line on the Harmon property. The smoke came fast. A post came down on me and I couldn't get clear." He paused. "Someone got me out. I never saw who. I wasn't tracking clearly. By the time I could think straight, they were gone." "You were propped against a juniper tree," Naomi said. Cole's breath went out of him slowly. "You were saying something when I found you," she said. "I couldn't hear what. The wind was wrong." "I was counting," he said, almost to himself. "I used to count when I was panicking, since I was a kid. I don't know why it helped, but it did." Naomi looked at him. He looked like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying for 3 years without knowing how heavy it was, and the putting down of it had left him uncertain what to do with his hands. "I kept looking," he said. "After. Asked around the volunteer crews, anyone who might know. Nobody knew who'd worked the fence section on that end of the Harmon property that day. I wasn't from there," she said. "I was passing through. Working a short contract on the Burke place, 12 miles east." "Burke," he repeated. He'd know the Burke place. Everyone in that stretch of country knew it. "I didn't think to ask there." "You wouldn't have found me anyway," she said. "I left 2 days after the fire. Contract was finished." She looked at the blanket. "I kept my half for a year and then lost it in a move." Cole looked at the burned wool under her hands. "I found this in the fence line when I went back. It was half buried. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't know who had left it, but it seemed like proof. That someone had been there. That it had actually happened the way I remembered, and not the way a half-conscious person remembers things, which is poorly." Naomi said nothing. She was watching him with an attention that she wasn't trying to disguise. "I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it," Cole said. "And because I couldn't—" He put his hands on the table, flat, the way she had hers. "I couldn't figure out how to be grateful for something when you didn't know who to be grateful to. So I kept it. Felt like the right thing to do with something I didn't understand yet." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the sound of the ranch waking up. A horse moving in the near pasture. Pete's voice somewhere near the bunkhouse. The routine small sounds of a working morning. "I should have gone back," Naomi said. "You had fires to deal with." "I know, but I thought about it. After." "I know you did." He said it simply. "I could tell from the way it was done. The way you got me clear. Someone who's just passing through doesn't work that hard." She looked at him for a long moment. "You were a stranger." "Yeah. I didn't know you." "I know." "I would have done it for anyone in that situation," she said. It was important to her that he understood that she hadn't done something heroic, she'd done something necessary, and those were not the same thing. I know, Cole said for the third time, and the third time had a different weight than the first two. That's exactly the kind of person you are. That's not a small thing, Naomi. That's actually the whole thing. She looked away first. Out the kitchen window, where the April morning was doing what April mornings in Montana do, which is look beautiful and cold and completely indifferent to the interior lives of anyone looking at it. I don't know what to do with this, she said quietly. Not to him specifically, just honest. I don't either, Cole said, but I've got some thoughts. She looked back at him. Something in his face had changed again, settled, this time, into a kind of clarity that she hadn't seen there before, as if the revision had finished, and this was the face for the right room. Not right now, he said. We've got a fence post to reset before rain. She blinked. Then something happened in her face that she didn't prevent. A short, involuntary breath that was almost a laugh. The kind that happens when the distance between where you are emotionally and where you physically have to be is so precise that your body doesn't know whether to cry or find it funny. Right, she said. The fence post. The fence post, he agreed. He stood. She folded the burned blanket carefully and set it to the side of the table, and she stood too, and they went out into the cold morning to do the work that needed doing, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the kitchen had been rearranged, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. The fence post took most of the morning. The ground was cooperative in the sense that it had softened enough to work, but uncooperative in the sense that 3 feet down it turned into clay that wanted to hold the old post in place regardless of what anyone above it wanted. Tom came out to help in the early afternoon, took one look at the situation, and came back 20 minutes later with a different tool that he'd apparently known about the whole time and had been waiting to be asked about, which was a quality of Tom's that Cole had accepted as simply part of how Tom operated. With the right tool, they had the old post out in 40 minutes and the new one set by 3 o'clock, just as the clouds from the northwest finally made good on their intention and delivered a cold, steady rain that was going to go on for most of the night. They stood under the overhang of the barn, Tom and Cole and Naomi and Pete, watching the rain settle in with the easy permanence of weather that has decided to stay. That post would have gone by end of May, Tom said, looking out at the fence line. I know, Cole said. Tom glanced at Naomi. Good catch. Naomi nodded, not pleased with herself, just acknowledging the thing. Pete looked out at the rain with the expression of a 23-year-old who finds weather genuinely interesting rather than inconvenient. You think it'll run through the weekend? Probably, Cole said. Good time to get to those records in the east storage room, Naomi said. She'd mentioned this before, a set of inventory records from the 2 previous seasons that had been improperly cross-referenced and were creating gaps in the herd history that would matter if the estate review went deep enough into the operational documentation. Cole looked at her. Tonight? If you want, I want. Tom made no comment on this exchange and walked away toward the bunkhouse with the decisive movement of a man who intends to dry off. Pete followed him, still looking at the rain as if he expected it to do something interesting. Cole and Naomi stood under the overhang for a moment more. I need to ask you something, Cole said. Another one, she said. Not unkindly. The Pueblo offer, he said. How long do you actually have? She looked at the rain. 3 weeks. From today? From last week. He nodded slowly. 2 weeks then. And you haven't answered them yet? No. Why not? She was quiet for a moment. The rain came down in a steady curtain beyond the overhang, and the smell of wet earth and old wood surrounded them with the particular quality of shelter that is only meaningful when something is actually coming down outside. I'm waiting to see how something turns out, she said. He looked at her. What's something? She met his eyes. I'm not ready to say yet. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. Same word. Same weight. Again. They worked on the East storage records that evening, side by side at the kitchen table, with the rain doing its steady work against the windows and the lamp between them, casting the yellow light that made everything look simultaneously older and more honest than it did in the daytime. The records were as bad as Naomi had suspected. 2 seasons of inventory entries that had been made by different hands with different methods, some in pencil that had faded, some with date formats that didn't match the other entries, a section from the second half of the previous season that appeared to be in a different order than any system Cole could explain. Who kept these? Naomi asked. 3 different people, Cole said. He was going through the older entries, matching them to receipts he'd found in the box beneath. I kept some of them. The vet records are mine. The rest, I had a full-time hand until last spring. And before that, my father had a woman who came in twice a month to do the books, and she retired when he got sick. What was her system? Good one, Cole said. I just didn't learn it properly before she left. Naomi looked at him. Why not? He was quiet for a moment, turning a receipt in his hands. My father was dying, he said. There were other things I was focused on. Naomi said nothing. She took the receipt from him gently and placed it in the correct position in the sequence she was building. We can reconstruct most of this, she said. The vet records are complete, and the purchase receipts give us the herd numbers at each interval. It'll take a few evenings. I know. The gaps in the middle section aren't fatal. We can annotate them honestly, unknown due to record transition, rather than trying to fill them with approximations. Cole looked at her. You think Finch will accept that? Finch is a careful man, she said. Careful men prefer honest gaps to suspicious completeness. A record that admits what it doesn't know is more credible than one that pretends to know everything. She paused. In my experience. Cole considered this. You've dealt with estate reviews before? My father's estate, she said. When the will was contested, not by me, but by a distant relative who thought the stepbrother arrangement was irregular. The review lasted 4 months. She set down another receipt in its place. I learned a lot about what reviewers actually trust. Cole watched her work for a moment. The rain against the windows, the lamp between them, the records spreading across the table in the slow order she was building from chaos. Naomi, he said. She looked up. When this is over, he said. The review, Grant, all of it. When it's resolved, I want you to stay. She looked at him for a long time, not the way she looked at problems, not the assessment she applied to fence lines and water levels and damaged livestock. Something different, something that had more exposure in it. On what basis? She said carefully. Whatever basis you can accept, he said. Permanent position, fair wages. Or, he stopped. He was a man who chose his words with care and who found, in this particular moment, that the words he'd chosen weren't quite sufficient and he was going to have to try again. Or something else. Something I haven't had the right to offer you yet, but might, if things go the way I think they're going. Naomi was very still. That's not a very specific offer, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. I'm not. He put his hands flat on the table, the way he did when he was trying to be accurate. I'm not a man who moves fast on things that matter. I wasn't certain enough to say anything more than that yet. But I wanted you to know that the question of what you do after the 30 days, it matters to me. More than the records and the fences and all of it. Naomi looked at her hands on the table, at the records between them, then at him. Ask me again, she said quietly. When it's over. When everything Grant is going to throw at us has been thrown. Why then? She met his eyes. Because I won't know until then if I can trust the feeling I have right now. And I don't make decisions about things that matter to me without trusting them fully. A slight pause. You're the one who said you'd rather have an honest gap than a suspicious completion. Cole absorbed that. He hadn't said it, she had, but the principle was sound, and he knew she was applying it correctly. All right, he said. She went back to the records. He went back to the receipts. The rain came down outside, and the lamp held between them, and the work between them was genuine and steady, and neither of them said anything more about the other thing, because there was a time for it, and the time was not yet. And both of them understood that, and the understanding was, for now, enough. What Grant Mercer did 4 days later was the thing that changed the shape of everything. He filed a formal complaint with Harold Finch's office. Not a suggestion, not a casual inquiry, a documented, signed complaint asserting that Cole Mercer was engaged in fraudulent misrepresentation of his domestic situation for the purpose of influencing the estate review, and attaching to it 3 witness statements from individuals in Crestfall who claimed to have information supporting the assertion. Cole received notification by phone on a Monday morning. He was in the kitchen when the call came. Naomi was outside with Pete, checking the post they'd set before the rain. He stood at the kitchen counter after he hung up and looked at the wall the way he'd looked at the wall in February when the letter from Clara Hutchins had arrived. The same wall. Different problem. Same particular quality of the floor dropping slightly beneath what he'd thought was solid. Harold Finch required a formal response within 10 days. The response needed to address, with documentation, the nature of Naomi's presence at Walker Ranch and the basis on which she resided and worked there. If the response was insufficient, Finch had the authority to refer the matter to the county court for adjudication, which would delay the estate review by potentially 6 months and give Grant a longer runway to do more damage. Cole went outside and found Naomi. She was on one knee near the base of the reset post, checking the set with a level that she carried in her coat pocket. She looked up when she heard him and read his face before he said a word. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it. The complaint, the witness statements, the 10-day deadline. Pete, who was holding the level, looked between the two of them and then found something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. Naomi stood up slowly. She put the level in her pocket. She looked at Cole with the expression of someone who has heard bad news before and knows the particular steadying it requires. "What do the witness statements say?" she asked. "I don't have them yet. Finch's office will send the full documentation by end of week." "Okay." She was thinking, visibly. "When we have them, we'll know what we're actually dealing with." "It could go to court," Cole said. "I know." "If it does, I'll testify," she said. "Whatever you need." Naomi. He looked at her directly. "If this gets harder than it already is, if Grant escalates beyond what I can reasonably ask you to deal with, I need you to know that you can walk away. The Pueblo offer is still open. You don't owe me." "Stop," she said. He stopped. "I'm not walking away from this ranch because Grant Mercer filed a piece of paper." She said it the way she said things that were final. Not loud, not dramatic, just utterly without negotiation. "Not because of obligation. Because he's lying, and I'm not going to let a lie stand if I have the ability to contest it." She paused. "And because this ranch deserves better than what he's trying to do to it." Pete, still looking at the middle distance, turned slightly away as if he'd heard something in a different direction, which was his way of indicating that he was not listening to this conversation despite being 3 feet from it. Cole looked at Naomi for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. She shook her head slightly. "Don't thank me yet. We don't know what those statements say." The documentation from Finch's office arrived on Thursday. Cole opened it at the kitchen table in the evening, with Naomi sitting across from him, and they read it together. The 3 witness statements were from people Cole recognized. One was from a man named Dave Pryor, who ran a small property east of town, and who had a long and uncomplicated history of agreeing with whoever had bought him a drink most recently. The second was from a woman named Carol Tish, who worked at the county records office, and who, Cole now realized, was Grant's former sister-in-law, a connection he had never previously considered relevant. The third was from a man Cole didn't know at all, someone named R. Caldwell, whose statement was oddly detailed about Naomi's behavior in public, detailed enough to suggest he'd been watching from somewhere rather than encountering her naturally. The statements were carefully constructed. They didn't make direct accusations. They described instead a series of observations: Naomi's presence on the property, the ambiguity of her role, conversations they claimed to have overheard that suggested the arrangement was designed to create a domestic impression rather than serve a genuine working purpose. Naomi read her copy without speaking until she reached the end. "R. Caldwell," she said. "I don't know that name." "I don't either." "Grant hired him," she said. "Not a guess? A conclusion?" "Probably." She set the papers down. "Carol Tish works at the county records office." "Yeah." "So she has access to estate documentation." Cole looked at her. He hadn't made that connection yet. "You think Grant has been getting information through her?" "I think it's worth asking Finch whether the estate documentation has been accessed by anyone outside his direct office." She said it carefully. "If Grant has been seeing the documentation ahead of the formal process, it explains why he's been able to move this fast." Cole looked at the papers, at the name Carol Tish, at the careful constructed language of someone who had been told what to say and had said it with just enough variation to look organic. "We need a lawyer," he said. He'd been resisting it, the cost, the formality of it, the acknowledgement that this had become something that required that kind of defense. But this was past the point of resisting. Yes, Naomi said simply. I know someone in Billings, James Pratt. My father used him. Call him tomorrow, she said. First thing. Cole nodded. He looked at the papers again, then pushed them to the side of the table the way he'd pushed the February letter to the side, because some things you read once fully and then put down before they take up permanent residence in your hands. There's something else, Naomi said. He looked at her. The burned blanket, she said. She said it carefully. If this goes to court, if Grant's case is about the validity of our connection, about whether there's a genuine history between us, she paused. We have one, a real one, that predates anything Grant's trying to call manufactured. Cole was still. 3 years ago, she said. That's documented. The fire was documented. The volunteer crew records exist. Your medical record from that day exists, I'd assume. And I was on the Burke property, which is verifiable. She looked at him. It doesn't prove everything, but it proves we're not strangers with a manufactured connection. It proves the opposite. Cole looked at her across the table. He'd asked himself in the past week whether what he felt when he looked at Naomi Cross was complicated by the revelation of the fire, whether it was gratitude taking the shape of something else, or something else that the revelation had simply clarified. He'd spent a fair amount of quiet time working through that distinction, and he'd come to the conclusion that the answer was the latter, and that the conclusion didn't particularly surprise him, and that the fact that it didn't surprise him was probably its own kind of information. You'd be willing to present that, he said. Yes, she said. Truthfully, I was there. It happened. She held his gaze. Everything we'd be saying to Finch or a judge about it would be accurate. Not about us, he said. She looked at him. What do you mean? About what happened 3 years ago. Accurate. He paused. About what's happening now. I want to be careful that we're not using the truth about one thing to imply something about another thing that hasn't been decided yet. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then something happened in her expression that he'd seen happen once before. The involuntary quality, the thing that got through before she could arrange it. That, she said quietly, is an incredibly honest thing to say. I'm trying to be. I know. She looked at her hands. I know you are. A pause. I think we can present the truth about what happened 3 years ago and let it stand as what it is, context, history, a connection that was real before any of this was. She looked up. What comes after that is a different question. We'll answer that one separately. Cole nodded. Outside, the Montana night had gone fully dark, and the wind had dropped to something quiet, and the ranch was holding its ground around them the way old land holds around the people who are trying to do right by it, not supportive exactly, just present, solid under the feet, indifferent and reliable in the same motion. Call Pratt in the morning, Naomi said. She started gathering the documents into a neat stack. First thing, Cole said. She carried the stack to the counter and set it down with the level precision she brought to everything she touched. Then she turned and looked at him from across the kitchen. We're going to be okay, she said. It wasn't the kind of thing she usually said. She was not a person who offered reassurances easily or accepted them gracefully. She said it the way she said things she'd looked at carefully from every angle and found to be structurally sound. Cole looked at her from across the table. Yeah, he said. I think we are. James Pratt drove up from Billings on a Friday morning in a car that was older than his reputation suggested and in better condition than his appearance suggested, which Cole took as a reasonable sign that the man had his priorities straight. He was 62, compact through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of listening to people tell him things they'd rather not have to say in front of anyone. He'd handled Cole's father's estate matters for 11 years and had attended the funeral, which was not something he'd been paid to do. He sat at the kitchen table with the Finch documentation spread in front of him and read it with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that reactions cost money and clarity was free. Naomi sat to Cole's left. She'd been introduced to Pratt with the same directness she brought to everything, and Pratt had shaken her hand and looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality of a man who needed to know quickly who he was working with, and whatever he'd concluded he'd kept to himself, which Cole noted as professional rather than suspicious. Pratt finished reading. He set the last page down and aligned it precisely with the others, which appeared to be a habit rather than a statement. Carol Tish, he said. She's in the county records office. Has been for 7 years, Cole said. And she's Grant's former sister-in-law. His brother's ex-wife. They divorced 4 years ago. Pratt looked at the statement. She have any reason to want to help Grant specifically? I don't know, Cole said. They were never close from what I saw at family events. Money then, Pratt said. Not a question. Or leverage. One or the other. He moved to the R. Caldwell statement. This one's hired. The level of detail is specific in the wrong direction. Too much observation, not enough context. He watched rather than encountered. He set it down. I can work with that. What does working with it look like? Naomi asked. Pratt looked at her directly. He'd been doing this periodically since he arrived. Not dismissing her, just recalibrating his sense of who she was in the room. It means deposing him and seeing where his story breaks. Hired witnesses have the disadvantage of only knowing what they've been told. When you ask them about the gaps in what they observed, they either fabricate or they freeze, and either one is useful. Naomi nodded. The Pryor statement is the weakest, Pratt continued. Dave Pryor has testified in 2 prior matters in this county, and both times changed his account under cross-examination. Finch will know that. He looked at Cole. What concerns me more is the framing Grant has built around these. He's not claiming fraud outright. He's creating a pattern of suggestion. In a formal review, that pattern can be harder to refute than a direct accusation, because you can't fully disprove the implication the way you can disprove a fact. So how do we refute it? Cole said. You don't refute a suggestion, Pratt said. You replace it with something stronger. You give Finch and any judge who looks at this a factual record so complete and so consistent that the suggestion has nowhere to live. He looked at Naomi. Which means your documentation of the work you've done here needs to be airtight. It is, Naomi said. I'll need to see it. I'll have it for you this afternoon. Pratt looked at her again. Then he said, Cole mentioned there's additional context, a prior connection between the 2 of you that predates the current arrangement. Yes, Naomi said. Tell me about it. She told him. She was concise, direct, and complete. The fire, the date, the location, the specific actions, the saddle blanket. She didn't dramatize it, and she didn't minimize it, and she didn't editorialize about what it meant. She presented it the way she presented everything, as information, clearly organized, offered for whatever use it was. When she finished, Pratt was quiet for a moment. The fire report from that incident, he said. Volunteer crew records. County Fire Department would have them, Cole said. I was listed as the injured party. I have my own medical record from that day. I was seen at the clinic in Harmon, stitches, and smoke inhalation. Your name in the report? Yes. And the Burke property employment records would put Naomi in the area at that time? I can get a letter from the Burke family, Naomi said. The son runs it now. I'm still in contact with him. She paused. He'll remember the fire. Everyone in that area will. Pratt picked up his pen and made a note on the legal pad he'd brought. This is useful, not because it proves a romantic relationship. I want to be clear that we're not going to claim something that isn't documented, but because it demonstrates a genuine prior connection that completely undermines Grant's central assertion, which is that you're strangers performing familiarity for legal benefit. He looked between them. You're not strangers. You have a documented history. That's a different story than what Grant is telling. Cole felt something ease in him slightly. Not relief. The situation didn't warrant relief yet, but the specific lessening of tension that comes when you've been holding a problem alone and someone competent has picked up part of the weight. What's the timeline? He asked. Finch expects your formal response within 10 days. I'll have a draft to you in 4. We'll include the work documentation, the fire records, the employment corroboration, and a formal rebuttal of each witness statement. Pratt capped his pen. If Finch is the careful man you say he is, the documentation alone may resolve this at the review level without going to court. And if it doesn't? Pratt looked at him steadily. Then we go to court and we win there. He said it without drama, the way you say something you've done before and know the shape of. Grant's case is built on implication and bought testimony. Those are weak foundations in a courtroom. He left shortly after noon, taking copies of the documentation Naomi had given him and leaving behind the particular quality of settled purpose that good lawyers leave when they've decided they have something to work with. Cole stood on the porch and watched his car go down the gravel drive. Danny came up beside him. He'd been in the barn during the meeting, but had the air of a man who had been informed of the essential points. "He good?" Danny said. "He's good." Danny nodded. He looked out at the property, at the fencing visible from the porch, the pasture beyond it, the mountains farther still. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "Your dad built this place on 20 acres and 30 head and nothing else. Now you've got 240 and a solid herd and a ranch that was falling apart 2 months ago and isn't anymore." He paused. "Grant didn't build anything. He's just trying to take what someone else built. That matters in court." Cole looked at him. "Since when do you think about what matters in court?" Danny shrugged. "Since your cousin decided to be a problem." Cole almost smiled. He looked back out at the property, at the fence line on the north side that was right now, visibly from where he stood, in better condition than it had been in 2 years. "Yeah," he said, "it matters." The formal response to Finch's office went out on the 9th day, 1 day before the deadline. Pratt sent it himself, with copies to Cole and Naomi, and a third copy filed with the county court clerk as a protective measure that Pratt described as standard, and that Cole suspected was also a signal to Grant that they'd engaged someone who knew how these things worked. The response was 42 pages, including attachments. It contained Naomi's complete work record at Walker Ranch, organized by date, task, and verifiable outcome. It contained the herd documentation, the fence repair records with before and after assessments, the water line repair with the original faulty connector photographed and described. It contained 3 letters from the ranch hands. Tom's was 4 sentences and entirely factual, and was somehow the most forceful of the 3. Pete's ran to 2 pages and included more detail than was strictly necessary, but conveyed an earnestness that Pratt said would read well. Danny's was precise and exactly as long as it needed to be. It contained the county fire report from August 3 years prior, listing Cole Mercer as an injured party recovered from the Harmon fence line. It contained Cole's clinic record from that day. It contained a signed letter from Nathan Burke, who currently operated the Burke cattle property, confirming that Naomi Cross had been employed there during that period and that he personally recalled her participation in the community fire response. It contained a rebuttal of each witness statement, structured around the specific factual inaccuracies Pratt had identified. And there were several in each one, small details that a genuine observer would have gotten right. But a coached one had gotten slightly wrong, and the wrongness was documented against verifiable records. And at the end, in a separate section that Pratt had titled simply Additional Context, it described the saddle blanket. The 2 halves, the circumstances of each. The fact that Cole had kept his half for 3 years because it was all he had of a rescue he couldn't fully account for, and that Naomi had made the blanket herself and kept her half until she lost it in a move, and that finding the 2 pieces together in the storage room of Walker Ranch was the kind of coincidence that is only a coincidence if you believe that 2 people's lives can be completely separate and then suddenly, verifiably, not. Pratt had suggested including it. Cole had been uncertain. Naomi had been the one to say yes. "It's true," she'd said. "Every word of it is true. And the truth of it says more about who we are and how we're connected than anything Grant has alleged." She'd paused. "Let it speak." Finch's office acknowledged receipt on a Monday. They said they would respond within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were, in some respects, the strangest of Cole's life on Walker Ranch, because nothing happened and everything continued, and the combination of waiting and working created a quality of days that felt simultaneously suspended and very real. Naomi's 30 days had passed. Neither of them had mentioned it. She hadn't gone to Pueblo. She hadn't said explicitly that she wasn't going to Pueblo. She had simply continued. The morning checks, the fence work, the records, the mayor, the conversations at the kitchen table in the evenings that had long since stopped being just about the ranch. Cole didn't push it. He'd said what he'd said, and she'd said to ask her again when it was over, and it wasn't over yet. And he was a man who had learned the particular discipline of waiting for things to be ready. What changed during those 2 weeks was harder to name than a specific event. It was more like a slow shift in the quality of the ordinary. The way the light in the kitchen in the mornings had started to feel inhabited in a way it hadn't before Naomi. The way the ranch hands had stopped adjusting their behavior when she walked into a room and had started just behaving the way they behaved, which was the specific comfort of someone who has been absorbed into the daily fact of a place. Tom Briggs was the one who named it, characteristically without decoration. He came to Cole on a Thursday evening and said, "She staying?" Cole looked at him. "I don't know yet." Tom was quiet for a moment. "She should." He walked away. That was the entirety of Tom Briggs's position on the matter, and it was, Cole thought, about as clear an endorsement as Tom had ever given anything that wasn't a fence post or a piece of equipment. Margaret Holt came out to the ranch on a Saturday. She drove herself, which she was still doing at 73 despite her son's periodic objections. And she arrived mid-morning and got out of her truck and walked directly to where Naomi was working with the sorrel mare in the near paddock without going to the house first. Cole watched from the porch. The conversation between the two women lasted about 40 minutes. He couldn't hear it. He could see the quality of it. Margaret doing the talking for the first 10 minutes, Naomi listening with the complete unperforming attention she gave to things she was taking seriously. Then Naomi talking, and Margaret listening with her head slightly tilted in the way that meant she was weighing what she heard. Then both of them quiet, looking at the mare for a while, in the companionable way of people who share a language they don't need to speak. Margaret came to the porch when she was done. "That's a good woman," she said to Cole. She said it the way she said things, not as a compliment, as a report. "I know," Cole said. Margaret looked at him. "Garrett thought well of her too. He mentioned her in a letter he wrote me before he died, said he'd had a hand who'd figured out a water situation on his east pasture that had been wrong for years." A pause. "He didn't use her name, but I've been listening to her talk and I'm fairly certain it was her." Cole looked at the paddock. Naomi was walking the mare on a loose lead now, and the mare was going with a willingness that hadn't been there 5 weeks ago. "I'm going to speak to Finch," Margaret said, "directly. I've known Harold Finch for 30 years and he knows what my word is worth. I'm going to tell him that I've seen this ranch, and I've spoken with this woman, and the picture Grant is painting is not the picture I'm looking at." She leveled her gaze at Cole. "If he still wants to refer it to court after that, at least he'll know he's doing it against my opinion." Cole looked at her. "Margaret, don't thank me," she said. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because Grant Mercer is a liar, and I have enough years left that I'd rather spend some of them saying so than keeping quiet about it." She went back to her truck and drove away with the same decisive directness she brought to everything, and Cole stood on the porch for a moment before he went down to the paddock. Naomi looked up when he approached. She had the easy quality of someone who had been doing something they're good at and isn't tired of it. "How'd it go?" Cole asked. "She's sharp," Naomi said. "Sharper than she needs to be at her age, which means she probably always was." "She's going to talk to Finch." Naomi looked at him. "I know. She told me." He nodded. The mare had stopped walking and was standing with her nose near Naomi's shoulder, the same way she'd been standing since the second week. The particular trust of an animal that has been handled honestly. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi said. "You can ask." She looked at the mare for a moment. "When your father left you this ranch, did you want it? Or was it just what happened?" Cole thought about that honestly. "Both," he said. "I loved this place and I wasn't ready for it, and I've spent 3 years trying to figure out which one was louder on any given day. And now?" He looked out at the property, at the fences that were right now holding correctly, at the cattle in the east pasture that were watered properly, at the order that had been imposed on the chaos not by him, but with him, which was a different thing. "Now I know I want it," he said, "not just because it was his, because I've seen what it can be." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "That's a good answer," she said. She didn't say anything more, and Cole didn't push, and the mare stood between them in the mild morning, and the paddock held them all with the patient indifference of good ground. Finch's response came not in 2 weeks, but in 11 days, which Pratt said was faster than expected and meant something, though he wouldn't speculate what until he'd read it. He called Cole from Billings within an hour of receiving the document. "He's not referring it to court," Pratt said. Cole sat down. "He's issuing a finding that the complaint lacks sufficient evidentiary basis to warrant formal adjudication, and that the documentation provided by your response is consistent with a genuine working arrangement that predates and is independent of any estate considerations." A pause on the line. He also noted in his formal language, which is careful but readable if you know what you're looking at, that the witness statements showed internal inconsistencies that reduced their credibility substantially. What about the additional context section? Cole asked. The fire. He mentioned it, Pratt said, not in the finding itself, but in an accompanying note. He said it was, and I'm reading directly here, material that significantly recontextualizes the nature of the relationship between the parties and supports the conclusion that no fraudulent arrangement exists. Cole was quiet for a moment. What does this mean for the estate review? He said. It means it proceeds as scheduled. Grant's complaint is dismissed. His ability to raise the same complaint again is severely limited. You can't refile a dismissed complaint without new evidence, and he doesn't have any. Pratt paused. He can still contest the review itself, but he's lost his primary mechanism for delaying or disrupting it. Cole let out a slow breath. Thank you, James, he said. Thank yourself. The documentation was thorough. The fire corroboration was the thing that moved it. Finch is a careful man, and careful men don't like discovering that a complaint has been filed against a documented history. Another pause. Call me after the estate review. We're not finished, but we're in a better position than we were this morning. Cole hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a full minute before he went to find Naomi. She was in the east pasture checking the trough levels, which she did daily with a regularity that had become as natural a part of the ranch's rhythm as the morning feeding. She was writing something in her notebook when he crossed the pasture toward her, and she looked up when she heard him, and her pen went still. She read his face. Finch dismissed it, she said. Finch dismissed it. She closed the notebook. She looked at the trough, then at the mountains, then back at him. She nodded once, the way she nodded things that were structurally sound. Good, she said. Cole looked at her. That's it? Something moved in her expression, that involuntary quality again, the thing that got through. What would you like me to do? Celebrate? I don't know, he said. Maybe. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, I'm glad. I'm genuinely glad. A pause. I'm also aware that this isn't over. The estate review is still coming. 30 days, Cole said. She looked at him. Yes. The other 30 days, he said. The 30 days until the estate review. Not the 30 days they'd started with, which had long since passed without either of them marking the ending. A different 30 days, with a different weight. I know, she said. He took a step toward her. Not close. There was still a respectful distance between them, had always been. Neither of them were people who moved into that distance carelessly, but closer than the professional distance they'd maintained. Naomi, he said. She waited. I told you I'd ask again when it was over, he said. This part isn't fully over, but it's over enough that I don't want to wait the rest of the way. He held her gaze. I want you to stay. Not as an employee. Not as a temporary arrangement or an open question. I want you to stay because this ranch is better with you in it, and because I am, and I'm not a man who says that kind of thing unless I mean it, and I've been sure I meant it for longer than I've been ready to say it. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. The east pasture wind moved between them, the kind that comes off the mountains in late April, with the cold still in it, but the direction changed, coming from the south now, rather than the north, which in Montana meant something about the season turning. Cole, she said. Yeah. I turned down the Pueblo offer 2 weeks ago. He went still. I called Nathan Burke and asked if he'd write the letter for Pratt, she said. While I was on the phone with him, he asked if I was still planning to take the Colorado position, and I told him no. She looked at the ground for a moment, then back up at him. I'd already decided. Cole absorbed that. Why didn't you say anything? Because you'd said to wait until it was over, she said. And it wasn't over. A slight pause. And because I needed to be sure I wasn't deciding based on what was happening with Grant. I needed to be sure I was deciding based on what was actually here. And? She held his gaze. And I'm sure. The specific feeling that came over Cole in that moment was not the dramatic, overwhelming thing that people describe in stories. It was quieter than that. More like the feeling of a fence line that has been repaired correctly. Solid in a way that doesn't need to announce itself. He reached out and she reached back. Not simultaneously, but within a second of each other. And they stood there in the east pasture in the wind from the south with the mountains, at the distance they'd always been, and the cattle making their sounds in the middle distance, and the trough running properly for the first time in a long time. I should tell you something, he said. He hadn't let go of her hand. All right. I'm not easy to be around when I'm worried about the ranch, he said. I go quiet in a way that isn't fair to whoever's near me. I've been told it feels like disappearing. I know, she said. I've seen it. And you're still… I go the other direction, she said. I get mechanical. I focus on tasks and stop being present as a person. It's how I manage things I can't fix directly. A pause. It probably isn't easy to be around either. He looked at her. I've seen that too. And you're still here, she said. Yeah, he said. I am. They walked back to the house in the late afternoon light, not saying much, which was the way they'd always been at their best. Present without performance, together without explanation. Grant came to the ranch one more time. It was 3 days after Finch's dismissal, and he came in the evening, which Cole thought was probably deliberate, an attempt to catch them in an unguarded domestic moment that he could photograph or describe or use as something. Cole heard the truck on the gravel and went to the porch. Naomi was in the kitchen. Danny was somewhere near the barn, and Cole suspected he'd already heard the truck and was positioning himself, not aggressively but present, which was Danny's version of support. Grant got out of his truck and stood at the base of the porch steps. He looked different than he had the previous times, not the same carefully managed affect, not the easy performance of casual dominance. He looked tired, and Cole thought, behind the familiar smoothness of his expression, there was something that might be the specific exhaustion of a man who has run a campaign that hasn't worked. Finch dismissed it, Grant said. You know he did, Cole said. He stayed on the porch. Grant put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the property around him with an expression that Cole couldn't entirely read. Not grief, not quite. Something closer to calculation that hadn't finished computing. You put together a thorough response. We had a thorough truth to work with. Grant looked at him. The fire thing. Yeah. A long pause. I didn't know about that. No, Cole said. You didn't. Grant looked at the house, at the kitchen window where the light was on, where Naomi was presumably working at the table the way she worked every evening, unperformed and real. She the one who got you out? Yes. Another pause, longer. Something moved behind Grant's eyes that Cole couldn't entirely account for. Not regret, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of a man who has said and done things in a direction and has now been shown the full picture of what he was saying them about. I didn't know that, Grant said again. Quieter this time. I know you didn't, Cole said, but you knew what you were doing regardless. You knew you were trying to take something that wasn't yours. Grant looked at his shoes for a moment, then at Cole. Dad left you this ranch because he liked your father better than mine. Always did. That might be true, Cole said. It doesn't make it yours. Grant's jaw moved. The estate review is in 30 days. I know. I'm not going to contest it, Grant said. I want you to know that. I don't have the grounds to contest it now, and I'm not going to waste Pratt's time or Finch's time on a fight I've already lost. He said it flatly, without the performance he usually brought to statements of defeat, which made Cole think it might actually be true. All right, Cole said. I need you to know something, Grant said. He looked up at Cole directly, which was the first time in this conversation he'd done that without managing it. What I said at the station, that first day. He paused. I was out of line. Cole looked at him. You were worse than out of line. I know. Grant held his gaze. I know what I was. Cole said nothing for a moment. He looked at his cousin, the heavy shoulders and the tired eyes and the face of a man who had spent significant energy on something that hadn't paid out and was standing in the wreckage of it with whatever honesty he had available. Go home, Grant, Cole said. Not the way he'd said it at the station, with the flat edge of a last warning. Just straight. An ending. Grant nodded once. He got in his truck and drove down the gravel drive without looking back, and the sound of it faded into the evening, and then the property was quiet again, with just the ordinary sounds of an April night in Montana. Wind from the south, cattle, the distant call of something in the tree line. Cole stood on the porch for another minute. The kitchen light was still on. He went inside. Naomi looked up from the table. She had a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold, and a page of notes that had probably been forgotten for the last 10 minutes, because the angle of her head said she'd heard the truck and the conversation, or enough of it, through the kitchen window. "Grant," she said, "he's not contesting the estate review." She absorbed that. "Did you believe him?" Cole thought about it honestly. "I think he's out of money for the fight," he said. "I don't know if that's the same as being done with it, but I think for now, yes." Naomi turned her cup in her hands. "What he said about your father's, about why the ranch went to you." "It might be true," Cole said. He sat down across from her. "My uncle and my father had a complicated relationship. I don't know the whole of it." "Does it matter?" she asked. He thought about that. "No," he said. "The ranch is mine. What matters is what I do with it." She nodded. She looked at the page in front of her, then pushed it to the side. "I've been thinking about the southeast corner," she said. "The second ravine. There's a section where the spring runoff is going to cause problems if we don't address the grade this season. We have maybe 3 weeks before the snow melt hits that stretch." Cole looked at her. "You're thinking about the southeast corner." "The timing matters," she said, without apology. He held her gaze for a moment, and the thing that happened in him was the specific warmth of recognizing something you didn't know you'd been missing. The particular quality of a person who loves a place the same way you do, not for what it represents or what it means symbolically, but for the actual fact of it, the practical daily reality of ground and water and animal and season. 3 weeks, he said. If we're lucky with the weather, 2 if we're not. Then we should start planning it this week. I was thinking the same thing, she said. She pulled a fresh page from her notebook and set it between them on the table, and Cole pulled his chair slightly forward, and they bent over the page together in the kitchen light, and outside the Montana night went about its business, indifferent and reliable, the way it always had. The estate review was scheduled for a Thursday in late May. James Pratt drove up from Billings the night before and stayed in the room above the Crestfall post office that functioned as the town's only guest accommodation, which he described as character building. He arrived at the ranch early, before 8, and sat with Cole and Naomi at the kitchen table for an hour going through the review process. Finch will conduct it at the county offices, Pratt said. It's not a courtroom proceeding. It's an administrative review. But it will be formal. He'll have the estate documentation, your response to Grant's complaint, and whatever Grant's attorney has submitted on his side. Grant has an attorney now? Cole said. He retained one 2 weeks ago. A man named Cliff Ansell, out of Great Falls. He's competent, but conservative. Pratt looked at his notes. He's submitted a revised argument on Grant's behalf. Not the fraud allegation. That's done. He's arguing instead that the estate clause around personal stability should be interpreted more broadly, in a way that doesn't favor either candidate and essentially asks Finch to split the estate. Cole looked at him. Split it. It's a fallback position, Pratt said. It's what you argue when you've lost your primary case and you're trying to salvage something. It's not nothing, but it's much weaker than what Grant started with. He looked at Cole and Naomi in turn. Finch will likely ask you both questions. Not under oath. This isn't a deposition, but on the record. He'll want to understand your situations. Cole, the ranch's operational status and your plans for it. Naomi, he paused. He may ask about your intentions with respect to the property. Naomi looked at him. What kind of intentions? Whether you see yourself as having a long-term role here, Pratt said. Not, I want to be careful here. Not in any personal capacity that isn't documented, but in the operational sense. You've been the primary driver of the ranch's improvement over the past 6 weeks. Finch will have seen that in the documentation. He may want to understand whether that continues. Naomi looked at Cole. Cole looked at Naomi. I'm staying, she said to Pratt, in whatever capacity makes sense going forward. I have a permanent position here. She said it steadily and without a glance at Cole to check whether it was true, because she already knew it was. Pratt wrote something on his legal pad. Good. Say it exactly like that if he asks. The drive to the county offices took 40 minutes. Naomi sat in the passenger seat of Cole's truck and looked out at the country the way she'd looked at it on the first drive, the day he'd brought her from the train station, except that the country looked the same and she was seeing it differently, which was not the same thing as the country having changed. Cole drove with both hands on the wheel. You nervous? She said. Some, he said. Me too, she said. He glanced at her. You don't show it. I know how not to show it, she said. That's different. He nodded. They drove for another mile in the morning light, the mountains ahead of them and the ranching country around them doing what it did, which was exist without opinion. Whatever happens in there, Cole said. I know, she said. She didn't need the rest of it. He could tell she didn't, and he let it go. Harold Finch's office was on the second floor of the county building, and the room where he conducted estate reviews was a conference room with a long table and windows that looked out over the parking lot, which was not the view either of them would have chosen, but which was at least honest about what it was. Grant was already there with Cliff Ansell when they arrived. Grant looked at Cole when they came in, and then looked at Naomi for a moment with an expression that wasn't the old performance of contempt and wasn't quite anything else yet. Something in between, in the process of becoming something different. He didn't say anything, neither did Cole. Finch came in at exactly 9 o'clock, which Cole took as information about the kind of man he was. He was mid-60s, gray at the temples, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck and the measured quality of someone who had been doing careful work for a long time and had developed strong opinions about patience and precision. He looked at both parties, acknowledged both attorneys, and sat down. We're here today for the estate review of the Walker Ranch property pursuant to the terms of the late Robert Mercer's estate instrument, he said. I want to be clear about the scope and purpose of this proceeding before we begin. This is not a trial. This is an administrative determination. I am not here to adjudicate personal matters or to make judgments about character. I am here to assess, based on the documented evidence and the estate instrument's language, which party best meets the criteria for the estate distribution as written. He opened the folder in front of him. The instrument requires that the designated recipient demonstrate responsible stewardship and personal stability. I will be looking at both. He looked at Cole first. Mr. Mercer, please describe the current operational status of Walker Ranch. Cole described it. He described it the way he'd describe a fence line, honestly, without embellishment and without minimization. The state it had been in 18 months ago, the state it was in now, the specific improvements that had been made and the specific work that remained. He didn't attribute everything to Naomi. He described it as a collaborative operation, which was accurate, and which was also the choice he'd made because it was the true choice. Finch listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions, both specific, both about the water situation and the herd numbers, which meant he'd read the documentation thoroughly. Cole answered both accurately. Then Finch looked at Naomi. Ms. Cross, he said, you've been working at Walker Ranch for approximately 6 weeks. Yes, she said. The documentation provided by Mr. Mercer's response to the complaint against him, the operational records, the herd documentation, that's primarily your work? A significant portion of it, yes, she said. The ranch hands contributed. Cole's herd management knowledge informed the decisions. I organized and executed. Finch looked at her over his reading glasses. You intend to remain on the property? Yes, she said. In what capacity? She looked at him directly. I'm the ranch manager, she said. That's what the work has been. That's what it'll continue to be. Finch wrote something, then he looked up. You were present at the Harmon fire incident 3 years ago. Yes, she said. And you were the individual who assisted Mr. Mercer at that time. Yes. Finch nodded slowly. He looked at the folder, then at Cole, then at Naomi. Then he looked at Grant. Mr. Mercer, he said, addressing Grant, I've reviewed the complaint you filed and the evidentiary basis for it. I've also reviewed the response filed by Mr. Cole Mercer and the corroborating documentation it contains. He paused. Your attorney has submitted a revised argument regarding the interpretation of the estate clause. I've read it. Another pause. I want to ask you directly. Do you have anything to add in your own words to what's been submitted? Grant looked at his attorney. Cliff Ansell gave a slight neutral nod that meant, your call. Grant looked at his hands on the table, then at Cole, then at Naomi. No, he said. I don't have anything to add. Finch looked at him for a moment, then he closed the folder. I'll have a written determination to both parties within 5 business days, he said. This review is concluded. He stood. He shook hands with both attorneys. He looked at Cole and Naomi once more, with the specific look of a man who has been doing this long enough that he knows what the answer is before he writes it, and is simply observing the people involved with the respect of someone who understands that the paperwork is the last step rather than the whole story. Then he left. The room was quiet. Cliff Ansell said something quietly to Grant. Grant nodded once, stood, and picked up his jacket. He looked at Cole across the table. "Good luck with it," he said. Cole looked at him. "Thank you," he said. He meant it, which surprised him slightly, but it was the right thing, and he meant it. Grant left. His attorney followed. The room held just Cole and Naomi and Pratt, and the parking lot window, and the particular quality of silence that comes after something formal has ended. Pratt made a note on his legal pad. 5 business days, he said. I expect it'll be fewer. Cole looked at Naomi across the table. She looked back at him. The involuntary thing was in her face again, stronger than usual, and she wasn't doing much to arrange it away this time. Okay, she said. Same word, same weight, same word she'd used the first night he'd offered her a job, and the night she'd told him she'd turned down Pueblo, the word that in her vocabulary carried more freight than most people's paragraphs. Okay, Cole said. Pratt looked between them and then found something important to write on his legal pad. They drove home in the morning light, and the mountains were where they'd always been, and the land around them was the same land it had always been, and neither of them said much, but the silence was the established kind. The kind that holds something real rather than avoids something difficult. The kind that 2 people make together over the slow accumulation of honest days. Pratt's written determination arrived in 3 business days, not 5. Cole was at the barn when his phone rang, and he took the call standing in the doorway with the morning behind him and the smell of horses and hay around him, and Pratt's voice on the line was the same steady, measured instrument it always was, which meant Cole couldn't tell anything from the tone and had to wait for the words. Finch has issued his determination, Pratt said. The estate transfers to you, full and unconditional. The clause regarding responsible stewardship has been found satisfied in your favor. Grant's revised argument regarding the split interpretation has been rejected as inconsistent with the instrument's plain language. A brief pause. It's done, Cole. Cole stood in the barn doorway and looked out at the property. At the north fence line, which was right, and the east pasture, which was watered, and the mountains at their permanent distance, which were the same mountains his father had looked at for 40 years. Thank you, James, he said. His voice was even. He was surprised by how even it was. Congratulations, Pratt said. Call me if Grant does anything stupid. I don't expect he will, but call me if he does. Cole hung up and stood there for another moment. I wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel. Some dramatic release, maybe, or the specific elation of a fight that's finally finished. What he felt instead was quieter than that. Solider, like something that had been leaning against a temporary support had finally been properly anchored. He found Naomi at the southeast ravine, which she'd started on 3 days after the estate review, because the snow melt had done exactly what she'd said it would do, and the timing had been exactly as tight as she'd calculated. She was on her knees in the mud at the base of the grade they'd been working, checking the runoff direction with a level and a stick, and she had mud on both arms and a focused expression that meant she was in the middle of a measurement, and he should wait. He waited. She finished. She stood up and looked at the result and made a small sound of satisfaction that wasn't quite a word. Then she looked at him. She read his face the way she always read his face, directly, efficiently, without performance. Finch, she said. It's done, Cole said. Full transfer. Unconditional. Naomi looked at him. Then she looked out at the ravine, at the grade they'd been working, at the water running correctly down the line she'd calculated 3 weeks ago in the kitchen with her notebook. Good, she said. He almost laughed. He didn't, but it was close. That's all you've got? She looked back at him, and the involuntary thing was in her face, wider this time, less managed than usual. I'm relieved, she said. I'm very relieved. I don't know what the appropriate response to good news is when you've been braced for something else for 2 months. Me neither, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she held out her hand, which was muddy from the wrist down, and he took it anyway, which made her actually smile. Not the near smile she'd been rationing since March, but a full one, the real version, and it changed her whole face in a way that he thought he'd probably remember for a long time. Okay, she said. Same word. But this time it meant something different than all the other times. This time it meant they'd gotten through. They walked back toward the house, hand in hand across the pasture, and the mud from her hand transferred to his, which was fine, and the morning was cold and clear in the way that Montana mornings in late May are cold and clear, and neither of them said much, and it was enough. The ranch hands found out within the hour. Information on Walker Ranch traveled at roughly the same speed as information in Crestfall generally, which was fast, and Danny had apparently known something was happening from the quality of Cole's face at breakfast, and had been waiting, and when Cole told him, he just nodded with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose prediction has been confirmed. Tom Briggs said nothing. He walked to the north fence, stood there for a minute, then walked back and went to work, which was the Tom Briggs equivalent of celebrating. Pete, who had no such restraint, made a sound of genuine excitement and asked 3 questions in rapid succession that Cole answered one at a time, and then Pete went to find the others to tell them, and his voice carried across the yard in the morning air with the uncomplicated happiness of someone who had been working hard for a good outcome and was glad the outcome was good. Margaret Holt called that afternoon. She'd heard, of course she'd heard, Crestfall had heard by noon, and she said, in her characteristically direct fashion, "Harold made the right call." "He did," Cole said. "He usually does. He's a careful man." A pause. "How's your ranch manager?" Cole looked at Naomi across the kitchen, who was on her own phone, apparently talking to Nathan Burke about something related to the corroboration letter, because she kept saying, "I know," and "yes, he did," in the way you say those things to someone who is expressing satisfaction about a prior decision. "She's fine," Cole said. "She's good." "She should come for dinner sometime," Margaret said. "Bring her. I want to talk cattle with her properly, without the cloud of legal trouble overhead." "I'll ask her," Cole said. "Don't ask," Margaret said. "Just tell her. She'll appreciate the directness." Cole thought about that. "You might be right." "I usually am," Margaret said, and hung up. Grant Mercer left Crestfall 9 days after the determination was issued. Cole heard about it secondhand, a neighbor who'd seen the truck packed and heading toward the county line. No word sent, no call made. Just the particular departure of a man who has run out of moves in a place and has decided that the dignified thing is to leave without explaining it. Cole thought about that for a while, about Grant's face in the conference room, saying he had nothing to add, about what Grant had said on the porch that last evening, that the ranch had gone to Cole because their fathers had different relationships with Robert Mercer, and how that might be true, and how that kind of truth was the most corrosive kind, the kind that isn't a lie, but becomes one in the hands of someone who uses it to explain away everything they've decided not to take responsibility for. He didn't feel triumphant about Grant being gone. He'd expected to, and he didn't, which told him something about what the whole thing had actually been about, at least on his end. It hadn't been about Grant. It had been about the ranch, and about what the ranch required, and about the people who'd stood with him in it. He mentioned this to Naomi one evening, obliquely, while they were doing the end-of-day records at the kitchen table. "Grant's gone," he said. "I heard," she said. She was writing something in the ledger. "I thought I'd feel better about it than I do," he said. She looked up. "How do you feel?" He thought about it. "Like it was always beside the point," he said. "He was never really the problem. The ranch's problems existed before Grant filed anything. The fencing, the records, the water, those were real things regardless of what he was doing." Naomi set down her pen. "The problem with people like Grant is that they convince you they're the main thing," she said. "They make so much noise that you start organizing everything around them. And then when they're gone, you realize the actual work was always just the work." She paused. "That's probably what he was counting on, that you'd be so focused on him that you'd stop seeing the ranch clearly." Cole looked at her. "When did you figure that out?" "About 2 weeks in," she said. "When I noticed that every time his name came up, the conversation shifted away from what actually needed doing." She picked up her pen again. "I started keeping it separate in my head. The Grant problem and the ranch problem. They overlapped, but they weren't the same problem." Cole absorbed that. "You didn't say anything." "You were managing a lot," she said, "and you were getting there on your own." She looked at him briefly. "You didn't need me to tell you what you were already figuring out." He looked at her for a moment with the specific warmth of recognizing someone who has been paying careful attention to you without making it about themselves, which is rarer than it sounds, and more valuable than most things. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I was reading Clara's letters, the ones she sent before she lost her nerve, she described what she was looking for. He said it carefully. She said she wanted someone who would see her, not just what she could do or what roles she could fill, someone who would actually look at her and see who she was. He paused. I wrote back and told her I understood, and I did, intellectually, but I don't think I really understood what she meant until I was paying attention to someone who has been doing that for me for 2 months without making any kind of announcement about it. Naomi was still. Her pen was in her hand, but she wasn't writing. Clara was right to go home, Cole said. Not because she was wrong about me. I think she might have been right about me, actually, in ways I couldn't see at the time, but because what she needed wasn't something I had yet. And now? Naomi said. Now, Cole said. I think I'm getting clear on what I have and what I want to do with it. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Outside, the late May evening was doing what late May evenings in Montana do. Going golden and then going long, the light lasting past the hour when it had any right to. The kind of evening that makes ranching country look like someone's idea of a painting, which is fine as long as you remember it's also just Tuesday. Ask me, she said. He looked at her. Now? You said you'd ask again when it was over. She held his gaze. It's over. Cole set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the kitchen table, across the ledger between them and the lamp between them and the months between them and the years between them that they hadn't known were between them until they were standing in the same storage room looking at the same burned wool. He stood up. He came around the table and he stood in front of her and she turned in her chair to face him. And he wasn't a man who made speeches, had never been, and so he didn't. Marry me, he said, straight. No architecture around it. Naomi looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at fence lines and water levels and horses and the land from the truck window on that first drive, for information, for accuracy, to see what was actually there rather than what she hoped or feared might be. What was there was Cole Mercer, who was not easy to be around when he was worried about the ranch, who went quiet in unfair ways and had been honest about it, who had made sandwiches with too much mustard and hadn't noticed, who had stood on a porch and told his cousin to go home and meant it and said thank you and meant that too, who had kept half a burned saddle blanket on a shelf for 3 years not knowing what it meant and not throwing it away. Yes, she said. He reached out and she took his hand, and it was the same gesture as the pasture that morning, simple, direct, without ceremony. And that was right, because they were not people who needed ceremony to mean something. He pulled her up from the chair, and she stood in front of him, and they stayed there in the kitchen in the lamplight for a moment before she said, with the dry quality that lived just underneath her seriousness, like water under good ground, "The southeast grade is going to need another day's work before it's properly finished." He looked at her. I know. I just want to be clear that we're doing that tomorrow regardless. Naomi. Yes? I know, he said. She smiled. The real one, the full one, and leaned into him, and he put his arms around her, and outside the Montana evening went its slow gold way toward dark, and the ranch settled around them with the sounds of an old place at rest that is also, at the same time, just beginning. The southeast grade got finished the next day, and the day after that they drove to the county clerk's office in Billings and filed the paperwork. And the day after that Pratt called about a property easement issue on the south line that needed attention. And the week moved forward the way weeks on working ranches move, not in dramatic chapters, but in the accumulation of tasks and decisions and days that add up to a life if you're paying attention. The wedding was in July, under the old cottonwood at the east end of the property, which had been there longer than the ranch house and would probably outlast it too. The tree was Margaret Holt's suggestion. She'd seen it on her visit in April and had said, unprompted, "That's where you do it." And Naomi had looked at the tree and nodded without asking what Margaret was referring to, because she'd already been thinking the same thing. It was not a large ceremony. Tom Briggs was there, standing with his hands clasped in front of him and his best hat on, which Cole had seen perhaps 3 times in 6 years. Pete stood beside Tom with the expression of someone who was genuinely moved and making no effort to hide it, which was consistent with how Pete approached most things. Danny stood slightly apart from the others in the way that Danny always stood slightly apart, observing with the quiet attention of a man who understands the weight of things without needing to say so. Margaret Holt sat in the chair that Pete had carried out for her, because she'd said she'd stand, but Pete had insisted, and she'd let him, which said something about Pete's powers of gentle persuasion when he believed he was right. Nathan Burke had driven up from Wyoming. He was a quiet man of about 40, weathered and easy in the way of people who have been outdoors most of their lives, and he had shaken Cole's hand and looked at Naomi for a moment with the expression of someone seeing a person arrive at something they'd always been heading toward. James Pratt came. He stood at the back and wore a tie that was slightly too formal for the occasion and exactly right for who he was. The ceremony was short and plain because both Cole and Naomi had agreed, separately and then together, that the words they'd already said to each other in kitchen light and in muddy pastures and at fence lines with the wind coming off the mountains were the real ones. And what happened under the cottonwood tree was just the formal acknowledgement of something that had already been decided. The officiant was a county judge named Patricia Reeves, who happened to be Danny's older sister, a connection that Danny had mentioned only when asked, and that Naomi had found, when she heard it, both surprising and completely consistent with Danny's general approach to life, which was to have things in order without making announcements about it. Judge Reeves asked the standard questions, and Cole and Naomi answered them, and when it was done, and the afternoon held them all under the cottonwood tree with the sky doing its usual complicated work above them, and the mountains at their permanent distance, and the ranch extending in every direction around them, ordinary and real. Tom shook Cole's hand and said nothing, which meant everything. Pete hugged Naomi, which surprised her enough that she laughed, a real and slightly startled sound, and Pete apologized, and she said, "Don't apologize," and he did it again, which made her laugh a second time. Margaret, from her chair, held Naomi's hand for a moment and said, "Garrett would have liked you very much." Naomi looked at her. "I know," she said. "I liked him too." "Good," Margaret said. "That's enough." Nathan Burke found Cole at the edge of the gathering, looking out at the east pasture. "She turned down a good position to stay here," Nathan said. "I want you to know she wasn't settling." Cole looked at him. "I know that. Good." Nathan looked out at the pasture. "She's the best I've seen at reading land and reading animals and figuring out what something needs before it knows it needs it. Don't waste that." "I don't intend to," Cole said. Nathan nodded. He looked at the mountains. "Fine country up here." "Yeah," Cole said, "it is." What followed the wedding was not the resolution that stories sometimes pretend happens, where everything that was hard simply stops being hard, and people move through their days without friction, and the land cooperates and the work is satisfying in the uncomplicated way of fairy tales. What followed was more honest than that. There were arguments, not many, but real ones. The kind that happen when two people with strong opinions about the right way to do things are working the same ground. The first significant one was about the cattle rotation schedule in August. Naomi had a methodology she'd developed over years, and Cole had a different one developed over different years, and both of them were right in the ways that two right things can coexist until they have to share the same pasture, at which point someone has to yield, and neither of them was naturally inclined to yield. Danny later said he'd heard it from the bunkhouse, but claimed he couldn't make out the words, which Cole and Naomi both suspected was not entirely true, but appreciated anyway. They resolved it by doing what they generally did with things they didn't immediately agree on, which was to work through it rather than around it, to say the actual thing rather than the diplomatic version, to come out the other side with a plan that neither of them had started with, and that worked better than either original for reasons that had to do with combination rather than compromise. It wasn't smooth, but it was honest, and honest was what they'd both signed up for. There were hard seasons too. The following winter was the kind that tests ranches the way nothing else does. Extended cold, a late blizzard in March that hit the newborn calves hard, 3 weeks of the kind of work that is just endurance wearing the face of effort. Naomi lost 2 calves on a night when the temperature dropped faster than forecast, and Cole found her at the barn at 2 in the morning, and she was not crying, but she was close, and she said she should have moved them inside earlier, and he said she couldn't have known, and she said she should have known, and he said, "You're right," and she looked at him and he said, "You should have known. You're good enough that you might have caught it, and I'm sorry you didn't, and I'm glad you're the one watching this herd, because the next 200 calves are going to be in better hands for what you learned tonight." She'd been quiet for a moment after that. "That's a strange thing to say," she said. "Is it wrong?" She looked at the barn. At the calves that had survived, warming under the heat lamp she'd set up at midnight. "No," she said, "it's not wrong." He handed her coffee from the thermos he'd brought, which was hot and imperfect and exactly what was needed. And they stayed in the barn together until the cold eased slightly toward morning, and the calves that made it through the night were fine by sunrise. That was the winter. The spring that followed was better, and the summer was the best the ranch had seen in half a decade. And by the following autumn, Walker Ranch had a reputation in the county that it hadn't had in years, not for being grand or impressive, but for being well-run and fair, and the kind of place where the work was done right, because the people doing it believed the work deserved to be done right. Tom Briggs, at 64, stayed. He'd been asked, gently, by his daughter in Billings if he was thinking about retirement, and he'd apparently said no in a way that ended the conversation. He trained Pete with the same silent precision he'd used to train everyone, and Pete received it with the same earnest receptiveness he'd brought to everything since the first day. Danny Reeves, who had 9 years at Walker Ranch before Naomi arrived, had 13 by the time the story found its settled shape, and he had stopped describing himself as a hand who worked for the Mercers and started describing himself, to anyone who asked, as part of Walker Ranch in the way that certain people become part of certain places, through long presence and honest work and the slow accumulation of mornings. The herd grew steadily, not explosively. The documentation was kept current. The fences were maintained with the philosophy that a fence repaired before it fails is a different kind of investment than a fence fixed after cattle are gone, which was a philosophy Naomi had brought with her and which had become, without announcement, the operating principle of the property. Margaret Holt came for dinner 3 times a year, which she had decided was the right frequency and organized accordingly. The dinners always ran long and always turned, at some point, to the kind of conversation that 2 women who love land have when they've both been around long enough to have opinions about it that are worth hearing. Cole sat at these dinners and mostly listened and occasionally contributed and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the particular quality of a life that contains the people who are actually in it. The burned saddled blanket, both halves, sat on the shelf above Cole's desk in the ranch office. Naomi had sewn the 2 pieces together, not neatly, not in a way that hid the burn or the seam or the years of separation, but connected, the 2 halves back in the same object, even if the object showed clearly that it had not always been whole. Cole had come into the office one afternoon and seen it there, newly assembled, and had stood looking at it for a long time. Naomi had appeared in the doorway behind him. "I used the same stitch," she said, "diamond pattern, same thread color, as close as I could find." He looked at the seam where the 2 burned edges met, ragged and honest, nothing hidden. "It shows," he said. "It should show," she said. "It's true." He turned and looked at her. She was leaning against the doorframe in the easy way she'd developed of being in spaces on this property, not filling them, not performing presence, just there in the settled way of someone who has arrived and knows it. "You could have made it look better," he said. "I could have," she said, "but then it would have been about the blanket looking good instead of about what actually happened." She looked at it. 2 people were in a fire. One of them helped the other. They didn't know what it meant for a long time, and then they figured it out. She paused. "The blanket should tell that story, not a clean version of it." Cole looked at it for another moment, at the seam that showed exactly what had happened and didn't apologize for it. "Yeah," he said, "you're right." That was the thing about Naomi Cross, about Naomi Mercer, who was both and wore both names with the same practical directness she brought to everything else. She had an instinct for what things meant that wasn't sentimental and wasn't cold. She didn't dress things up, and she didn't strip them down. She just looked at what was true and said so. And the saying of it had a way of making the thing more real rather than less, which was harder to do than it sounded. Cole had been thinking, in the months since the wedding, about what it meant to be lucky. Not in the vague, grateful way of people who have had good things happen to them and want to acknowledge it without examining it, but specifically, actually, in the way that luck operates in real lives. He hadn't been lucky that Clara Hutchins got on a train and then got off it again. That wasn't luck, or wasn't only luck. It was Clara knowing what she needed and being brave enough to turn around and get it, which was its own kind of courage, even if it had left him standing on a platform feeling the floor drop. He hadn't been lucky that Naomi was on that platform. She'd been there because she was in transit between 2 things, between one chapter and whatever came next, carrying someone else's letter because she'd said she would, and she kept her word. He hadn't been lucky that she'd pulled him out of a burning fence line 3 years before any of this. She'd done that because it was necessary, and she was the person present who could do it, and because she was the kind of person who did necessary things. What he'd been lucky in, and he thought about this clearly, without mythology around it, was that when all those separate facts came together on a train platform in March, he'd made the right call in a single moment when he could have made a wrong one. He'd seen what was actually in front of him rather than what he'd been hoping for. He'd recognized something true in the way she stood, and the way she spoke, and the way she hadn't flinched when Grant opened his mouth, and he'd responded to the truth of it rather than the disappointment of his expectations. That was the moment. One decision in 30 seconds on a platform in Billings, made without information and without guarantee, to respond to what was real rather than what was planned. Everything after that had been the two of them doing the work. He told Naomi this one evening. They were on the porch after the day was done. In the late hour when the property settles and the mountains go dark against a sky that hasn't finished being light, the particular Montana evening hour that he had come to think of as the one that was specifically theirs. She listened. She thought about it. "I think you're giving yourself a little too much credit," she said. He looked at her. "How do you mean?" "You made a good call," she said, "but so did I. I could have handed you the letter and gotten back on the train. I had $200 and an open offer in Colorado. I didn't have to stay." "Why did you?" She looked out at the mountains. "Because something felt unfinished," she said, "and I don't do well with unfinished things." A pause. "And because you didn't laugh when Grant said what he said. You looked at me. That was enough to make me think the 30 days was worth trying." Cole looked at her. "I looked at you." "You looked at me," she said, "like I was a person and not a punchline." She said it simply, the way she said things that had weight without wanting to make them heavier than they were. That shouldn't be remarkable, but it was. He thought about that. About how a thing as small as looking at someone honestly could be the beginning of something, if the looking was genuine and the person being looked at was paying attention. "I've been thinking about that woman," Naomi said. "Clara." "What about her?" "I hope she found what she was looking for." She looked at the mountains. She was scared of honesty because she'd been hurt by someone dishonest. That's a specific kind of damage, the kind that makes the wrong things frightening. She paused. "I hope she found someone she could be scared with and have it be all right." Cole looked at her profile in the evening light. "That's a generous thing to feel about someone you've never met." "She gave me a letter to deliver," Naomi said, "and I delivered it. And look where we are." The near smile appeared. "I owe her something." Cole put his arm around her and she leaned into him the way she'd been doing for months now. Not leaning on him, not depending, just together. The weight of her against his side that was familiar now, that he'd stopped noticing the way you stop noticing things that are simply right. The ranch spread out around them in the dusk. The fences standing, the cattle settled, the mountains patient at their distance. The old cottonwood at the east end was a dark shape against the last light. The bunkhouse windows were yellow. Somewhere Pete was probably talking to someone about something with his characteristic unselfconscious enthusiasm. Danny was probably reading, which was what Danny did in the evenings. Tom was probably asleep because Tom went to sleep at 8:30 and didn't apologize for it. Walker Ranch, 240 acres that had belonged to Cole's father and his father's effort and now belonged to Cole and Naomi's future and their effort, and the future of that effort was specific and real. More cattle, better rotation, a bunkhouse expansion that Naomi had been planning since February, a breeding program she'd been developing that would take 3 years to show results, but that she'd described to him with the patient certainty of someone who thinks in seasons rather than moments. Cole looked at all of it and felt the thing he'd been unable to feel for 3 years of managing it alone. Not relief, not satisfaction exactly, but something closer to rightness. The specific quality of a life that is being lived in alignment with what it actually is, without pretending it's easier or grander or simpler than it turns out to be. It was hard. It would keep being hard. The seasons would do what seasons did, and the cattle would do what cattle did, and the equipment would break at inconvenient times, and the weather would be wrong at critical moments, and there would be mornings when everything felt like too much, and evenings when one of them was somewhere else in their head, and the other one had to decide whether to follow or give space, and sometimes they'd get that wrong. But the ground was good. The work was real. The people standing on it knew what they were doing and knew who they were doing it with. That was the thing Clara Hutchins had been looking for and hadn't been able to trust. That was the thing Naomi had stopped believing she'd find after her father's will was read, and her stepbrother walked into a life she'd built with her own hands. That was the thing Cole had been managing without, efficiently and inadequately, for 3 years of keeping the ranch alive through sheer stubbornness and refusing to admit how thin the margin was. It wasn't a grand thing. It didn't announce itself. It had arrived on a train platform in the body of a tall woman carrying someone else's bad news, and it had built itself quietly over months of mud and early mornings and honest arguments and a burned saddle blanket sewn back together with diamond-patterned stitches. Real things don't tend to announce themselves. They show up looking like work, and they feel like work. And it takes a while to understand that what you thought was just the work was also the life. The evening light faded from the mountains. The first stars appeared over the ridge, faint and then more certain as the sky darkened. Naomi's weight against his side, easy and present, the ranch breathing around them in the last of the day. Cole Mercer looked out at the land his father had built and thought about what it meant to deserve something. Not to be given it, not to inherit it, not to defend it from someone who wanted it, but to actually deserve it through the accumulation of days in which you showed up and did what the day required and didn't flinch from what was hard. He thought he might be getting there. Beside him, Naomi Cross watched the mountains go dark and thought about a woman on a platform in Denver who had made a frightened choice that had turned out, from a certain angle, to be the most generous thing a stranger had ever done for her. She thought about a fire 3 years ago and a man on the ground, and the specific weight of pulling someone towards safety when your shoulder was already wrenched, and the smoke was making your eyes water and you had more fire to deal with, and you didn't know who he was, and it didn't matter. She thought about 30 days that had become all the days after. She thought, this is what it feels like when you've stopped being in between things. She hadn't known, before now, that she'd been in between things her whole life. Between her father's ranch and whatever came next. Between Wyoming and Colorado. Between one contract and the next open offer. Always capable, always competent, always working someone else's land with the professional skill of someone who had never quite been able to stop and say, this one. This is the one. This one. This was the one. The mountains were fully dark now. The cottonwood was a silhouette. The ranch lights were yellow in the dusk. She took Cole's hand and held it, and he held hers back. And the evening did what evenings do. Went quietly and completely on, indifferent to the people in it, leaving them to make of it whatever they were going to make. They stayed on the porch until the stars were clear, and the cold had come down from the mountains with its particular late May decisiveness, and then they went inside, and the light came on in the kitchen, and Walker Ranch went on around them in the dark.